The experiment number was assigned on a Tuesday in March 2044. The family it belonged to had not yet applied for a vault spot. The youngest child had not yet been born. The father was still working at a shipping company in Sacramento, going about his days with no particular reason to think about underground shelters or corporate filing systems or the specific three-digit code that had already been written beside his home address in a sealed document he would never be allowed to read. That document existed. It was real. It sat in a locked cabinet in a Vault-Tec regional office, filed neatly alongside hundreds of others just like it, each one representing a family, a set of lives, a future that had already been decided by people those families had never met and never would. The code beside his name did not mean saved. It meant something else entirely. And by the time he understood that, the door would already be closed. Vault-Tec was not built to save people. That was the part they left out of every brochure, every billboard, every cheerful advertisement, featuring a round-faced mascot giving a thumbs up at the edge of a mushroom cloud. The public version of the company, the one that appeared in congressional testimony and civil defense pamphlets, and the glossy promotional materials delivered free to millions of American homes, described a corporation dedicated to the preservation of human life in the event of nuclear catastrophe. The language was careful, and the imagery was warm, and the message, repeated often enough and through enough different channels, became something most people simply accepted as true. The actual version of Vault-Tec was considerably more patient than that. The company was founded in 2031, in the autumn of a year when the country's optimistic surface was showing its first serious cracks. The resource wars had been grinding through the edges of the world for long enough that their pressure was now arriving in American daily life in subtle, undeniable ways. Fuel costs climbing without satisfactory explanation, congressional sessions growing longer and less reassuring, a quality of tension in government communications that people noticed without being able to name. Nuclear-powered cars still moved along clean streets. Robot servants still managed suburban households with quiet efficiency. The Nuka-Cola machines on every corner still hummed with their familiar cheerfulness. But underneath all of it, in the parts of American life that did not appear in advertisements, something had shifted. People were afraid. Not openly, not dramatically, but consistently, in the way that fear operates when it has nowhere specific to go. It settled into daily routines and budget decisions, and the particular way adults changed the subject when certain topics came up at dinner. It had no product attached to it yet, no outlet, no place to direct itself that felt productive. Vault-Tec's founders understood that unattached fear was simply a market waiting to be identified. The incorporation documents filed with the state of California that autumn described the company's mission in language broad enough to accommodate almost anything. Protective technologies for the atomic age, a phrase that committed the company to nothing specific, while suggesting everything reassuring. The founding itself was unremarkable. A signed document on a quiet morning, a modest initial investment, a small office in Los Angeles with more filing cabinets than furniture, and a handful of employees who believed, most of them genuinely, that they were participating in something important. The air in that first office carried the specific quality of beginnings. The smell of new carpet and fresh paint, and the particular energy of people who have not yet discovered what they have actually signed up for. The marketing came first, before the construction, before the government contracts, before any vault had been designed in anything more than conceptual terms. This sequencing was not accidental. Vault-Tec's leadership understood that the physical product, the underground shelters, the gear-shaped doors, the life support systems, was secondary to the psychological product. What they were actually selling was not safety. They were selling the feeling of safety, which was a considerably more scalable commodity. The Vault Boy, that round-faced figure with his permanent upward thumb, began appearing on materials distributed through civil defense organizations within months of the company's founding. His expression never varied. Whatever scenario surrounded him, blast radius diagrams, radiation exposure charts, illustrations of families descending cheerfully into underground facilities. He met it all with identical optimism. That consistency was the entire message. Whatever comes, you will be fine. You have prepared. You have chosen correctly. The fear that had been sitting in American households with nowhere to go now had a destination. A Vault-Tec representative in Pittsburgh named Harold Garner kept a personal journal during this period that would survive, water damaged but legible in the ruins of his apartment building. His early entries described his work with the kind of pride that comes from believing in what you are doing, helping families understand their options. One entry read, "People are scared, and they deserve to feel like someone is looking out for them. If that is what we are providing, then I am glad to be part of it." Later entries would read differently. But in the beginning, the belief was real, and real belief, distributed across thousands of representatives visiting millions of homes, was more effective than any advertising budget. By early 2032, the company had representatives in Washington. The meeting that changed everything took place on a February morning at the Pentagon, in a conference room that smelled of old coffee and institutional carpet. A senior defense official reviewed the proposals placed before him. Shelters capable of preserving not just civilian lives, but entire functioning sections of American infrastructure, medical facilities, research laboratories, communication systems, manufacturing capacity. He read through the documentation with the careful attention of someone who had been trained to see what documents were not saying as clearly as what they were. What the proposals were not saying was this: these structures could preserve military command. They could maintain government continuity through a nuclear exchange that eliminated every surface installation in the country. American institutional power would not end with the bombs. It would go underground, wait, and return. His internal recommendation was filed the following week. It was enthusiastic. The contract that resulted, a $50 million feasibility study for a national shelter network, delivered something more valuable than funding. It delivered access. Classified research on radiation exposure and long-term biological effects. Detailed projections on blast damage patterns across major population centers. Introductions to other defense contractors whose work overlapped with Vault-Tec's in ways that would become significant later. And the one thing that no amount of marketing could have purchased independently: the formal endorsement of the United States government. From the moment that contract was signed, Vault-Tec ceased to be a company that could be questioned without the questioner appearing unpatriotic. The decision had consequences that none of the people in that conference room were considering yet. The Pip-Boy was introduced to the public in the late 2030s as a utility device. Wrist-mounted, robust, capable of tracking health metrics and displaying navigational information and receiving radio frequencies and managing the complex inventory records of someone living in a closed environment for years at a time. The demonstrations were thorough, and the device performed exactly as shown. It was described in press coverage as the most practical piece of personal technology the atomic age had yet produced, and the description was not wrong. A woman in Phoenix named Carla Reyes strapped one to her wrist at a Vault-Tec demonstration event and told the representative beside her that it felt lighter than she had expected. She turned her arm over, examining the display, and said it almost felt like it belonged there. She had no way of knowing it was already transmitting. The location tracking built into every unit fed data back to Vault-Tec's monitoring infrastructure through channels not listed in the public specifications. The health metrics it collected, heart rate, stress indicators, sleep patterns were stored in databases that the device's promotional materials did not mention. The cheerful Vault Boy on the display screen greeted its wearer every morning with that familiar upturned thumb, and the warmth of that greeting was precisely calibrated. A surveillance instrument needed to feel like a gift. The ones that felt like choices were always the hardest to remove. The representatives reached every corner of the country by the early 2040s. They appeared at community gatherings and school events and civil defense briefings, setting up folding tables with scale models and illustrated charts, speaking in the calm and reassuring tones of people who had practiced those tones extensively. They emphasized community. The families you knew on your street would be the families surrounding you underground. The familiar made the unfamiliar bearable, and the representatives understood this and used it with considerable skill. Every interested family completed an application. Medical history, psychological assessment, presented as routine compatibility screening, family composition, occupational records, educational background, genetic information, gathered under health evaluation protocols that asked no alarming questions and raised no particular concern. Vault-Tec described all of it as necessary matching, ensuring that residents would be suited to their assigned Vault community. The matching was real. The nature of what families were being matched to was the part that remained carefully unspoken. Most of the representatives conducting these sessions did not know. The compartmentalization that protected Vault-Tec's actual intentions from outside scrutiny worked just as effectively on its own workforce. Harold Garner, the Pittsburgh representative whose journal survived the war, wrote in a 2043 entry about a family he had helped complete their application. A mother and father and two daughters who had driven 40 minutes to attend a community information session. Got them all sorted today, the entry read. Good people. They deserve a spot. He had believed that. The sincerity in his records is unmistakable. He had simply been given no reason to ask what kind of spot they had been sorted into. The fluorescent lights in the application processing centers ran through every shift without being turned off, casting their particular flat whiteness over rows of forms being filed and catalogued and cross-referenced against criteria their subjects would never see. The internal documents began changing in the mid-2040s. There was no announcement, no meeting at which the shift was formally declared. The change arrived in fragments, distributed across enough separate hands that no individual piece was large enough to constitute a clear picture. Engineers assigned to specific vault construction projects received design specifications that contained quiet discrepancies from the humanitarian mission Vault-Tec described in every public statement. A door engineered with a variance in its sealing tolerance, documented as a structural load adjustment. Water recycling system, built without the redundant backup that every other system in the vault received. Listed as a cost efficiency measure. An air filtration unit with a secondary input port, whose function the installation notes described only as reserved for future access. A young structural engineer named Dennis Ware spent 3 weeks working on the door specifications for a vault outside Bakersfield before noticing that the tolerance variance he had been given would result in an incomplete seal under operational conditions. He flagged it to his supervisor. The supervisor told him the specification had been reviewed and approved at a level above both of them, and that his job was to build what he had been given. Ware filed the note in his personal records and said nothing further. He told himself there was probably an explanation. He told himself someone above him understood the full picture. He built the door exactly as specified. The door would not seal completely. That had always been the intention. The people who made that decision were not thinking about Dennis Ware when they made it. They were not thinking about the family that would stand on the other side of that door. believing themselves protected. They were thinking about data, about what happened to human cells under sustained low-level radiation exposure, about what a population looked like after a generation of gradual contamination. They were thinking about the experiment. The name Bud Askins appears in none of Vault-Tec's public records, not in the congressional testimony, not in the press materials, not in the promotional films shown at civil defense events, or the educational pamphlets distributed to schools. He existed entirely within the company's interior, part of a group that had given itself a name, with the self-assurance of people who considered themselves essential, buds, the innermost circle of Vault-Tec's senior leadership, the people who knew what the vaults were actually for. Their framework was not simply greed, though greed was present. What distinguished this group from ordinary corporate criminals was the conviction, underneath the calculation, the absolute certainty, held with the steadiness of something that had long since stopped needing to argue with itself, that nuclear war was not a risk to be prevented, but a transition to be managed. The old world, with its uncontrollable populations and its inconvenient democracies, and its persistent refusal to organize itself according to rational principles, was ending. That ending was going to happen regardless. The only meaningful question was, who would be positioned to determine what came next? The vaults were the answer to that question. Not shelters, not humanitarian infrastructure, a mechanism, a controlled environment in which specific variables could be tested, specific populations could be observed, and specific data could be gathered that would tell the people who collected it exactly how to build a new civilization on the ruins of the old one. Every experiment running quietly behind a sealed door was feeding a larger project that its subjects would never be informed of and never consent to. The family whose experiment number had been assigned on that Tuesday in March 2044 was already in the system by the time they attended their first Vault-Tec information session, already categorized, already assigned. The representative who smiled at them across the table and helped them complete their application had no idea. The application processor who filed their forms had no idea. The vast majority of the people who built this system had no idea what the system was. But somewhere above all of them, in the sealed upper levels of Vault-Tec's institutional structure, a small group of people watched the database grow and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. The plan was proceeding exactly as intended. The vaults were being built, the populations were being selected, the experiments were being designed. All that remained was the war, and they had already decided that was coming too. The announcement was made on a clear morning in October 2054, and it was, by every visible measure, exactly what it appeared to be. The steps of a federal building in Washington served as the backdrop, chosen deliberately because federal steps meant authority, and authority meant safety, and safety was the only thing Vault-Tec had ever needed to sell. American flags moved in a clean autumn wind. A senior executive stood at the podium with the practiced stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and understood precisely what each word needed to do. The crowd below, journalists, government officials, carefully selected members of the public, listened as the numbers were delivered with the calm confidence of facts that had already been decided. 122 vaults, each one capable of housing 1,000 residents, each one buried deep enough to survive a direct nuclear strike, each one equipped with water recycling, air filtration, medical facilities, food production, and power generation capable of running for centuries without surface support. The total cost exceeded the defense budgets of most nations. The construction timeline was 20 years. The mission, the executive said, was the preservation of American civilization. The crowd responded the way the moment had been engineered to make them respond. Applause, relief, the particular exhale of people who had been quietly afraid for a long time and had just been given a reason to believe someone was handling it. 3 blocks away, a government courier was delivering a sealed package to a secure facility. The package contained the classified appendices to Project Safehouse, the documents that described what the announcement had not. Almost nobody in that crowd would ever read them. The ones who had already read them were not standing on those steps. They were watching from somewhere considerably more comfortable, with considerably more information, and no visible expression at all. The organization that had shaped Vault-Tec's direction from near its beginning had no official name in any public record. Among themselves, in the sealed communications and private meetings that constituted their actual operations, they were known as the Enclave. The membership was not a secret society in any dramatic sense. No ceremonies, no robes, no elaborate rituals of initiation. It was simply a collection of people who shared a particular understanding of how the world worked, and who had accumulated, collectively, enough institutional power to act on that understanding without requiring anyone else's permission. Wealthy industrialists whose companies held defense contracts stretching back decades. Senior military officers whose careers had given them access to threat assessments the public never saw. Government officials positioned at the precise intersections where policy, funding, and classified information converged. These were people who had spent their professional lives inside the machinery of American power and had arrived, through different paths, at the same conclusion. The machinery was running out of time. Nuclear war was coming, not as a possibility to be prevented. They had long since moved past that framing, but as a transition to be managed. The old world, with its inconvenient democratic processes, and its uncontrollable population variables, and its persistent resistance to rational organization, was going to end. The only question that retained any practical meaning was what came after. The vaults answered that question, not as shelters. The Enclave's own survival arrangements were entirely separate from the vault network, built into hardened facilities that the public knew nothing about. The vaults were laboratories, sealed environments in which the variables of human behavior could be isolated, tested, and recorded with a precision that no surface study had ever achieved. When the Enclave emerged from its own protected facilities after the radiation cleared, it would not be guessing at how to rebuild civilization. It would have data. Comprehensive, multi-generational data on governance structures, biological adaptation, psychological manipulation, and social organization under controlled conditions. The experiment matrix was not a corruption of Project Safehouse. It had always been the point of Project Safehouse. The public announcement on those federal steps was the packaging. This was the contents. The hum of encrypted communication lines in Enclave facilities carried a specific frequency during those years. Steady, patient, the sound of a long plan approaching its operational phase. The classified architecture of the Vault network divided 122 facilities into categories that existed in no document available to the general public, to most Vault-Tec employees, or to the majority of government officials who had voted to fund the project. Control vaults formed the smallest category. These facilities were designed to function precisely as the public announcement described. Stable populations, fully operational systems, genuine preservation. They served a specific scientific purpose. Without baseline data from vaults that worked correctly, the results from experimental vaults had nothing reliable to be measured against. The residents of control vaults were, in the framework of the experiment matrix, the lucky ones. They had been selected for stability rather than utility. Their lives would proceed largely as promised. Every other vault was a variable. Governance experiments occupied a significant portion of the matrix. These facilities tested what happened to human societies when authority was structured differently from the democratic models the residents had grown up with. One vault was designed so that all decisions, Resource allocation, leadership selection, conflict resolution would be determined entirely by games of chance. Another was built around a manufactured religion, its educational systems programmed to produce genuine theological belief in an artificial cosmology. A third would require its population to select one resident for execution each year, the threat of total life support failure used to enforce compliance, testing how quickly a community normalized institutionalized killing when survival was presented as the alternative. Resource experiments engineered scarcity with clinical precision. Populations were given food stores calculated to run short at specific intervals. Water recycling systems were designed to fail in predictable sequences. Medical supplies were inventoried at levels that would force rationing decisions within the first decade. The hypothesis underlying these experiments was straightforward. Understanding exactly where social order broke down under resource pressure would tell the enclave exactly how much abundance was necessary to maintain population compliance in the world they intended to build. Psychological experiments used the vault environment itself as the instrument. Sealed spaces, controlled light cycles, recycled air, and decades of isolation created conditions for manipulation that no surface study could have replicated. Some facilities embedded subliminal audio frequencies in their background systems. Others varied atmospheric chemistry in ways that produced specific emotional states, without residents ever identifying a cause. A vault populated with musicians had been designed around white noise frequencies calculated to induce progressive psychological deterioration. The experiment testing both the neurological effects of sonic manipulation and the social response of a community watching its members change. At the furthest edge of the matrix sat the biological experiments. These were the facilities that required the highest security clearances, the most specialized construction protocols, and the smallest number of people who understood what was actually being built. The ones who understood were not thinking about the families who would live inside. Ground broke on the first vault sites in late 2054, and the construction operation that followed was unlike anything American industry had attempted. Enormous boring machines, designed specifically for this project by engineering teams working under classification levels that prevented them from discussing their work outside designated facilities, carved through bedrock at depths that required entirely new approaches to structural reinforcement. The removed material, millions of tons of rock and earth displaced from sites across the continent, was transported and disposed of through logistics chains that appeared in no public infrastructure records. Some was incorporated into surface construction projects. The rest simply disappeared into a system too large and too deliberately obscured for any outside observer to follow. The assembly lines producing vault doors ran without pause across 3 shifts, day and night, in a Nevada facility that employed over 4,000 workers under comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Each door was a considerable engineering achievement independent of its purpose. Circular, gear-shaped, the interlocking teeth along its outer edge, machined to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. The design distributed stress across the entire surface of the door rather than concentrating it at any single point, which meant a multi-ton structure could be moved by mechanisms that would have been insufficient for a simpler design. They were built to last centuries. Most of them would. The workers who built them came from mining operations, heavy construction, industrial manufacturing, people accustomed to large projects and physical danger, and the particular discipline of keeping their questions to themselves when supervisors indicated that questions were not welcome. Most of them knew only their assigned portion of the work. A welder fabricating a specific interior component had no visibility into the overall vault design. An electrician running conduit through residential corridors had no access to the sealed technical spaces where the monitoring infrastructure was being installed. But some things were difficult to miss entirely. A construction foreman named Ray Gutierrez was assigned to a vault site in eastern Nevada for 11 months in 2057. His personal letters to his sister, recovered from a storage unit in the ruins of Las Vegas, described his work in terms that grew progressively more uncertain as the months passed. The first letters were straightforward. Long hours, good pay, impressive engineering. By the 8th month, his tone had shifted. There are rooms in this place that I have been told explicitly I am not authorized to enter. One letter read, I have been doing construction work for 20 years, and I have never been told that before. The equipment going into those rooms does not match anything in the plans I was given. I keep telling myself there is a reasonable explanation. He sent that letter on a Friday. The following Monday, he was reassigned to a different site without explanation. His replacement asked no questions. The construction continued. The automated systems that would manage vault operations for generations were developed through a partnership with Robco, industries that ran deeper than any public accounting of the relationship revealed. Robert House's company had been producing personal computing technology and robotics for long enough that its involvement in a large infrastructure project raised no particular suspicion. The Pip-Boy had already established Robco as a trusted Vault-Tec partner in the public imagination. The additional contracts for Vault terminal networks, for security robotics, for the Mister, handy units that would handle maintenance in residential areas, seemed like a natural extension of that existing relationship. The systems actually being built extended considerably beyond maintenance scheduling and residential assistance. The control architecture installed in experimental vaults was capable of operating the facility's experimental protocols entirely without human direction. Environmental systems could be adjusted remotely and automatically: atmospheric composition, lighting cycles, temperature, the chemical content of water supplies, based on triggers programmed into the system before the vault sealed. Security infrastructure could restrict access to specific areas, enforce population distribution across residential zones, and respond to behavioral indicators with environmental modifications designed to produce specific outcomes. The overseer terminal in each experimental vault gave its occupant the appearance of control. The actual decisions, the ones that mattered, the ones that determined what the population experienced, were being made by systems that had been programmed years earlier by people the overseer would never meet. The overseer in an experimental vault was not running the experiment. In most cases, without knowing it, they were part of it. A Robco systems engineer named Patricia Lowe spent 4 months writing the behavioral response protocols for a subset of experimental vault terminals. Her technical logs, preserved in a server backup that survived the war, are precise and detailed and entirely devoid of any reflection on what the protocols were for. The logs describe her work the way any competent engineer describes any complex programming task, as a problem to be solved correctly. The problem she was solving correctly was how to automatically administer psychological stimuli to a sealed population based on monitored behavioral triggers. She solved it correctly. The solution ran without error for decades. West-Tech's involvement in the Vault program was known to a number of people that could be counted on both hands. The defense contractor had been developing what its internal documentation called the Forced Evolutionary Virus, F, at a facility in Mariposa, California, under military contract. The research was classified at levels that placed it entirely outside normal oversight structures. West-Tech's scientists were attempting to engineer biological adaptability, to produce, through viral modification of human cellular structure, an organism capable of surviving conditions that would be lethal to an unmodified person. The research had been progressing for years, with results that were, depending on one's perspective, either promising or deeply alarming. The collaboration with Vault-Tec took the research in a direction its original parameters had not included. Certain vaults in the experiment matrix were designated for biological modification studies. Their construction required containment specifications that standard vault engineering did not cover. Sealed laboratory sections, hazmat protocols for specific installation teams, atmosphere management systems capable of maintaining precise chemical environments across decades of operation. The workers assigned to these sites were told only that they were building medical research facilities, requiring enhanced contamination controls. What they were actually constructing were the physical conditions necessary to expose a sealed human population to an engineered virus and observe, across multiple generations, what happened to people whose biology was rewritten at the cellular level. The scientists who designed these experiments had already arranged their own relocation to facilities with no biological hazard component. The families who would eventually walk through those vault doors had arranged nothing, because they had been told they were walking into a shelter. The distance between those two groups of people, the ones who knew and the ones who did not, was the foundation on which the entire experiment matrix rested. The public lottery for vault placement ran for 3 years, and it was one of the most effective pieces of theatre the company ever produced. Television broadcasts showed spinning drums filled with numbered balls, celebrity hosts, reading selections with the practiced gravity of people, delivering genuinely significant news, families watching from living rooms across the country, with the particular tension of people waiting to learn whether their future had been secured. The imagery was perfect, democracy in its most literal form, chance making no distinction between wealthy and poor, connected and ordinary, deserving and otherwise. Everyone equal before the numbered ball. The selection process operating underneath that theatre was something entirely different. Every applicant in the lottery pool had already been processed through Vault-Tec's matching system, screened against the experimental requirements of specific vaults before their numbered ball ever entered a drum. The vault designated to test extreme population density needed residents whose psychological profiles suggested high stress tolerance. The facility, built around a specific gender ratio, required applicants sorted by that ratio before any public draw occurred. The vault, designed to observe long-term social isolation, needed a population whose background indicators suggested they would survive confinement long enough to produce multi-generational data. The drums were real, the draws were real, the numbers were genuine. The pools from which those numbers were drawn had been constructed with precision that the televised ceremony was specifically designed to conceal. Wealthy applicants who investigated their options discovered that direct purchase of vault placement was not available. Premium application packages, however, priority processing, expanded household definitions, access to supplementary lottery pools, were available at price points that significantly altered the odds without technically constituting a guarantee. Government officials and senior military personnel received placement that bypassed the lottery entirely, classified as essential personnel provisions. The appearance of equality was maintained with great care because the appearance of equality was necessary. A lottery that looked rigged would have produced resistance. A lottery that looked fair produced something far more useful. It produced trust, and trust, as Vault-Tec had understood from its first corporate charter, was the only product that actually mattered. The numbered balls turned in their drums. The families watched their screens. In the sealed back offices of Vault-Tec's selection division, the real lists had already been finalized for months. 3 vaults were built to work. Not 3 exactly. The number was slightly larger than that, a carefully calculated minority within the full network. But the principle was the same across all of them. A small fraction of the 122 facilities were designed to deliver precisely what the public announcement had promised: functional water recycling, reliable power generation, food stores calculated to last decades, medical equipment maintained to hospital standards, populations selected for psychological stability and genetic diversity rather than experimental utility. Vault-8, situated in the Nevada desert, received systems that went beyond the standard specifications given to every other facility. Its water purification achieved efficiency ratings that Vault-Tec's own engineers described in internal memos as exceeding theoretical maximums. Its food stores included variety and preservation quality that most other vaults would never see. Most significantly, Vault-8 was one of a tiny number of facilities to receive a Garden of Eden creation kit, a GEC, in the shorthand that circulated among the engineers who built them. The technology packed into that single unit was capable of transforming irradiated and sterile ground into productive soil, of restarting agricultural cycles in environments that nuclear fire had rendered lifeless. Vault-8 was not merely designed to shelter its residents through the catastrophe. It was designed to give them the means to rebuild after it. Vault 76, built into the geology of Virginia, was designated as one of the first facilities to open after radiation levels on the surface dropped to survivable thresholds. Its population was selected accordingly. Engineers, physicians, agricultural specialists, administrators, people whose specific skills would be most valuable in the earliest phase of surface reconstruction. The Vault's internal training programs were oriented toward that future in ways that most other facilities were not. Residents would spend their years underground, preparing for a return, rather than simply enduring an indefinite confinement. These control facilities were not built out of generosity. Generosity had no operational role in the experiment matrix. They were built because the data collected from experimental vaults required a baseline. Populations living under genuinely functional conditions, against which the results of compromised and manipulated facilities could be meaningfully measured. The residents of control vaults were the lucky ones. They had simply been selected for a different purpose than the others. They would never know that a purpose had been assigned to them at all. The particular silence of a well-maintained vault, the soft cycling of air, through clean filtration, the steady hum of properly loaded power systems, was a sound that most residents of the network would never hear in quite that form. Vault 12 was built beneath the California town of Bakersfield, and its door was engineered to fail. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be immediately visible to the families walking through it on the morning the bombs fell. The floor was precise and deliberate. A variance in the sealing tolerance of the door mechanism, calculated to leave a gap small enough to be invisible to casual inspection, but large enough to allow radiation to seep through at a continuous, measurable rate. The gap had been specified in the construction documents under a technical designation that described it as a structural load adjustment. The engineers who machined the door to those specifications had been given no further explanation, and most of them had not asked for one. The hypothesis the experiment was designed to test had been written in a classified document that described the expected outcomes in clinical language. Gradual radiation exposure at controlled levels might stimulate adaptive cellular responses. A population subjected to continuous low-level contamination over multiple generations might develop biological traits that improved survival in radioactive environments. The framing was scientific. The language was careful. Neither the framing nor the language had any relationship to what it actually meant to be inside. Vault 12, when the door sealed and the radiation began its slow work. The first entries in Vault 12's resident journals described the usual adjustment period, the strangeness of underground living, the recycled air, the artificial lighting, the process of building routines in an unfamiliar space. Within the first months, a pattern of health complaints began appearing. Nausea attributed to the dietary transition. Skin sensitivity blamed on the air composition. Hair loss explained as a stress response. The Vault's medical staff, working from limited diagnostic equipment and no awareness of the doors, deliberate flaw, treated symptoms without identifying their source. The deeper changes came slowly enough that no single moment constituted an obvious threshold. Skin that had been irritated became skin that began to change in ways that no ordinary medical explanation could account for. The cellular transformation that radiation was producing in Vault-12's population was not the beneficial adaptation that the experiment's hypothesis had described. It was something the designers had not fully modeled, a grotesque stability, cells restructured into configurations that arrested the normal aging process, while degrading the physical form that process had previously maintained. The people of Vault-12 did not die from their exposure. Many of them simply became something that the word people no longer described, without qualification: ghouls. The term that the wasteland would eventually develop for what radiation did to the survivors of Vault-12 carried a specific meaning: the skin hanging in altered configurations, the features restructured by decades of cellular modification, the lifespan extended far beyond any human baseline. Some retained their full cognition, others lost it by degrees, their minds degrading along a separate track from the physical transformation, until what remained was a creature operating on instinct in a body that refused to stop existing. The experiment produced data. The Enclave's analysts, reviewing the results from a safe distance, logged their findings with professional thoroughness. What the families of Vault-12 had become was recorded as an outcome. What they had wanted, what they had expected when they walked through that door, was not a variable the study had been designed to measure. The construction of Vault-87 required hazmat protocols that its workers were told were standard procedure for medical research facilities. The vault was positioned in the region that would eventually be called the Capital Wasteland, built deep into stable bedrock, at a depth that provided protection against everything the designers were worried about. Its residential sections were indistinguishable from any other vault. Dormitories, common areas, a cafeteria, recreational space, the standard infrastructure of underground community life. The medical bay was larger than typical, which the public specifications attributed to the vault's designation as a regional health research center. The sealed sections behind the medical bay were not in the public specifications. Vault-87's experiment had been designed in collaboration with Vault-Tec's Biological Research Division, using a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus that had been in development at Mariposa for years. The residents selected for the facility had been chosen through the matching system for physical fitness and specific genetic markers that Vault-Tec's researchers had identified as relevant to FEV compatibility. None of them had been told this. The criteria had been embedded in the standard health screening that every Vault applicant underwent, described in the processing documentation as routine physiological assessment. The exposure chambers built into the sealed medical sections were functional before the Vault's first residents arrived. The protocols for their use, the dosing schedules, the monitoring procedures, the data collection framework had been programmed into the facility's automated systems, the same way that other experimental parameters had been embedded into other vaults. The overseer would receive instructions. The medical staff would administer procedures described as health optimization, treatments. The residents would comply because they had been told to trust the vault systems, and because the alternative, questioning the only authority structure available in a sealed underground environment, required a kind of resistance that most people needed time to develop. What the modified FEV produced in the residents of Vault-87 was a transformation so complete that the word transformation became inadequate. The exposed individuals did not change gradually. The viral modification of cellular structure operated at a pace that produced visible physical alteration within weeks. Muscle mass expanded beyond any natural human range. Skin shifted toward a distinctive green pigmentation as the virus restructured pigment production at the cellular level. Height increased. Bone density increased. The physical results were, by the metrics Vault-Tec's research had been designed to produce, impressive. Intelligence decreased. Not uniformly, not completely, but consistently, reduced in what the experiment's data logs described as an inverse correlation with the degree of physical enhancement. The transformed residents of Vault 87 retained enough cognitive function to understand, at some level, what had been done to them. They retained enough capacity for planning and coordination to do something about it. The containment failure at Vault 87 was not a malfunction. The security systems performed exactly as they had been designed to perform. The problem was that the transformed residents were stronger than anything those systems had been designed to contain and considerably more motivated. The researchers who had administered the exposure protocols had not secured their own exit before the transformation reached a threshold that changed the balance of power inside the facility. The vault's sealed doors, so effective at keeping the outside world out, proved equally effective at keeping everything inside in. The super mutant strain that would threaten the Eastern Territories for 2 centuries originated in a room that had been built to look like a medical facility and had functioned, for a brief period, exactly as intended. Vault 11 was built in the Mojave Desert, and the cruelty of its experiment was a matter of architecture. The Vault's computer system delivered its central instruction to residents within hours of the door sealing. 1 person would need to be sacrificed each year. The life support systems would fail if the sacrifice was not provided. The instruction was delivered in the same calm, institutional voice that the computer used for every other operational announcement. The same tone that informed residents of meal schedules and maintenance windows and recreational programming. It offered no context, no explanation, no indication of who had written the requirement or why. The experiment had not been designed to study the sacrifice itself. The Enclave's planners were interested in the behavior around it, the selection process, the social structures that would develop to manage an annual requirement for institutionalized killing, the philosophical frameworks that a community would construct to make the requirement bearable enough to continue functioning. They wanted to know how quickly a society normalized what was monstrous when the alternative was presented as collective death. The answer, documented in Vault 11's monitoring logs across multiple generations, was, quickly enough, the first year produced volunteers. People who stepped forward out of genuine conviction that their individual life was worth less than the community's survival. A retired teacher named Marjorie Alden was the first. Her final entry in the Vault's shared journal described her decision in terms that were neither dramatic nor despairing. "Someone has to," she wrote. "I have lived more than most of the others here. It seems like the reasonable thing." The entry was dated 11 months after the vault sealed. She walked into the designated room the following morning. The life support systems, which had never been in any actual danger of failing, continued to function without interruption. By the 3rd generation, volunteers were rare. By the 5th, the selection process had developed its own political infrastructure. Parties, campaigns, advocacy organizations dedicated to ensuring that the year's sacrifice came from a specific demographic rather than another. The philosophical frameworks that Marjorie Alden's simple reasoning had initiated had expanded into elaborate ideological systems, justifying why certain lives were more expendable than others. Children born into Vault 11 grew up understanding human sacrifice as a civic institution, as established and unremarkable as any other. The abnormality had become the baseline. The data collected from Vault 11 was considered among the most significant in the entire network by the analysts who reviewed it. The experiment ran for generations without external intervention. The residents maintained it themselves. The ones who gave the orders had been gone for decades. The orders remained, embedded in a computer system that continued to make its annual announcement in the same calm, institutional voice, and a community that had long since stopped questioning whether it had to listen. Vault 22 was designed to solve a problem, and it did. The problem was food. Underground populations needed sustainable nutrition sources that did not depend on surface supply chains or the indefinite viability of preserved stockpiles. Vault 22's experiment was built around genetically modified plant spores, engineered organisms capable of producing high-yield, nutritionally complete food in minimal light conditions with minimal water requirements. The botanical research underlying the design was sophisticated, and the early results, by every metric the experiment had been built to measure, were extraordinary. The plants grew. They grew with an enthusiasm that exceeded the projections built into the experiment's design parameters. Yields in the designated growing areas outpaced every estimate. The nutritional quality of the produced food was measurably superior to the preserved rations it supplemented. The Vault's residents experienced genuine improvements in their health indicators within the first year of full production. The scientists monitoring the results from their external observation post logged success after success, each entry noting the experiment's progress with the quiet satisfaction of people watching their models validated in real conditions. The spores did not stay in the designated growing areas. The ventilation systems that moved air through Vault 22's residential sections also moved. Microscopic spores through pathways that the experiment's designers had not modeled as vectors for contamination. The engineered organisms, built for persistence in low-resource environments, found the warm, humid conditions of the Vault's ductwork entirely hospitable. They established themselves in fabric fibers, in the materials lining the walls of corridors, in the organic matter present wherever human beings lived in close quarters. The interaction between the modified spores and human biology had not been a variable in the original experimental design. It became one. The transformation was gradual enough that its early stages were ambiguous. Residents noticed unusual growth on surfaces that should not have supported it. They noticed changes in their own physical responses to the Vault environment. They noticed eventually that the boundary between the botanical experiment and the human population was becoming less distinct than it had previously appeared. The last monitoring logs from Vault 22 were filed by an observer who noted, with the dispassionate precision that the experiment's documentation style had always maintained, that the facility had achieved a form of self-sustaining biological equilibrium. The note did not elaborate on what that equilibrium looked like from the inside. The observer was not inside. They had never intended to be. Vault 92 was given to musicians, and what was done to them was conducted with the patience of people who understood that the best experiments ran slowly. The residents were selected for their professional dedication to music. Performers, composers, music educators, people whose entire framework for understanding the world ran through sound. They were told, upon entering the facility, that its acoustic systems had been specifically designed to preserve and enhance musical ability. The background tones that would be present throughout their underground life were described as carefully calibrated frequencies, chosen to maintain auditory sensitivity and support creative performance. The frequencies were carefully calibrated. The purpose of that calibration had not been disclosed. The white noise system embedded in Vault 92's environmental infrastructure delivered its actual payload with a precision that the residents had no instruments to detect and no reason to suspect. The frequencies were designed to produce specific neurological responses: a gradual increase in baseline aggression, a progressive erosion of impulse regulation, an accumulating susceptibility to paranoid interpretation of ordinary social friction. The timeline built into the system's programming was long. The changes were intended to develop slowly enough that each stage felt like a natural deterioration rather than an induced one. In the early years, the Vault produced music of a quality that its residents themselves described as exceptional. The creativity that the background system was supposedly enhancing seemed genuinely elevated. Performances in the common areas drew audiences that filled every available space. The community was, by the accounts preserved in its journals, unusually cohesive. People united by shared vocation and mutual appreciation of each other's work. The irritability arrived so gradually that its first appearances were rationalized as individual temperament. Artists were temperamental. Everyone knew that. The first serious confrontation between two previously close collaborators was attributed to creative differences and professional stress. The second incident involving different residents was filed under the same explanation. The explanation held for longer than it should have, which was precisely what the system's designers had intended. By the time the pattern became undeniable, the baseline had already shifted far enough that undeniable was itself a moving threshold. The instruments in Vault 92 did not stop being played. The music continued long after the community that had made it coherent had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Sound traveled through the facility's corridors for years after the experiment had progressed beyond any outcome its designers had named in their original documentation. Not everyone who worked for Vault-Tec went home at the end of their shift without thinking about what they had built. A scientist assigned to the Medical Research Division of Vault 81, a facility near what would become Boston, had spent 18 months developing a pathogen exposure protocol, a system designed to introduce engineered diseases into the Vault's population through its water supply and observe the immune responses that developed across generations. The research was framed internally as preparation for post-war medical development, a study that would produce treatments for conditions that surface medicine had never been able to address. The framing was not entirely false. The data would have had genuine medical applications. 3 weeks before Vault 81 was scheduled to seal, the scientists disabled the pathogen dispersal system. Not dramatically, no confrontation, no announcement, no explanation filed with any superior. A specific component was removed and replaced with a non-functional substitute that would pass cursory inspection. The monitoring system that should have detected the sabotage had itself been quietly compromised during a routine maintenance visit 2 weeks earlier. The work was careful and thorough and entirely silent. The residents of Vault 81 walked through their door and lived their lives without ever knowing how close the water flowing through their taps had come to carrying something designed to make them sick for the benefit of people they would never meet. Other acts of resistance were smaller and less decisive. A construction worker who installed an unauthorized circuit override in a monitoring system he did not fully understand. An administrator who copied classified files onto physical media and hid the copies in locations that would not be searched. A programmer who introduced subtle errors into behavioral response protocols, errors small enough to survive review, but significant enough to limit the protocol's effectiveness over time. These were not coordinated efforts. The people who made them did not know each other, and in most cases, did not know the full extent of what they were working against. The records manager who spent months building a documented case, copying files, recording conversations, assembling evidence with the patience of someone who understood that what she had found required overwhelming proof to be believed, died in a car accident before her documentation reached anyone who might have acted on it. The circumstances were investigated briefly and closed, without finding anything irregular. Whether the irregularity existed, or whether the accident was simply an accident, was a question that the investigation was not structured to answer. The conscience of individuals inside an institution committed to deliberate harm was not nothing. It was simply not sufficient to change what the institution was doing. Vault 81 survived because one person made a different choice. 121 other vaults continued toward the futures that had been designed for them, carrying their populations toward outcomes that had been decided in sealed offices by people who would never live inside the consequences of their own decisions. The construction was complete. The systems were active. The populations had been selected and assigned and were already beginning the process of building lives in spaces that had been built, in most cases, for something other than living. Outside, the world was accelerating toward the event that would make all of it operational. By the mid-2060s, the word crisis had lost its ability to convey urgency. It had been applied to too many situations across too many years. The oil shortages, the border conflicts, the diplomatic breakdowns, the resource allocation disputes that had been escalating in slow increments for so long, that each new development felt like a continuation rather than a threshold. The public had developed a tolerance for crisis, the way a body developed tolerance for a low-grade fever. Uncomfortable, persistent, not yet severe enough to force a change in behavior. The actual condition of the world in those years was considerably worse than the word suggested. The Middle East had been transformed by a decade of conflict into something that bore almost no resemblance to what maps from the previous century showed. The oil that had sustained the global economy and that the resource wars had been fought to control was largely gone, extracted, burned, exhausted in the grinding machinery of conflicts that had consumed the region along with its resources. The fighting had not ended when the oil ran out. It had simply changed shape, becoming something older and more diffuse, carried forward by grievances that the original resource competition had generated, and that no diplomatic process had been structured to address. Europe was fracturing. The pressures of mass displacement from conflict zones to the south and east, combined with the economic strain of a global economy restructuring itself around scarcity rather than abundance, had pushed the continent's political coalitions past their tolerances. Nations that had spent decades building collaborative frameworks were finding that those frameworks had been designed for conditions that no longer existed. The fractures ran along every available line: economic, cultural, historical, and the speed at which they were widening was accelerating. Alaska was a war. The Sino-American conflict that had begun as a confrontation over resource access in the territory had settled into a grinding military engagement that neither nation could exit without consequences it was unwilling to accept. American forces held positions at considerable cost. Chinese forces pressed against those positions at equivalent cost. The casualty figures, released in carefully managed increments by a government communications apparatus that had become expert at making large numbers sound manageable, told a story that the public was being given just enough information to partially understand. Vault-Tec's intelligence division, staffed by analysts whose previous careers had given them direct access to classified threat assessments, was not working from the public figures. Their projections, circulated in encrypted documents to a list of recipients that grew shorter with each passing year, did not frame the question as whether nuclear exchange would occur. That question had been retired from the division's analytical framework sometime in the early 2060s. The projections measured timelines. They assessed probable flashpoints. They calculated the intervals between escalation thresholds and estimated the decision cycles of both governments with that dispassionate precision of people whose professional obligation was accuracy rather than reassurance. The cities still gleamed. Corvega plants still produced nuclear-powered automobiles at full capacity. The Nuka-Cola machines on every corner maintained their familiar hum. The optimistic surface of American daily life was intact, maintained by a combination of genuine material comfort and institutional commitment to projecting normalcy regardless of what the private assessment said. The gap between those two realities, the gleaming surface and the classified projections, was the space that Vault-Tec had always occupied. It was growing wider every month. Cooper Howard was not thinking about nuclear war on the Tuesday morning. He drove to a studio lot in Los Angeles for a contract meeting that would change the terms of his professional life. He was thinking about his daughter, about whether the school she attended was still as good as it had been 3 years earlier when they had moved her there, after the previous school's funding had been cut in ways that nobody at the district level had been willing to explain clearly, about whether the neighborhood they lived in would still be the same neighborhood in 5 years, about the kind of calculations that people made when they were paying attention to how much effort it was taking to maintain what they had. He was a working actor, recognizable enough to be employed consistently, not famous enough to be insulated from the ordinary pressures of a life lived without significant margin. The contract he was being asked to sign that morning was for a series of Vault-Tec promotional appearances. His agent had described it as straightforward corporate work, good money, minimal creative demands, the kind of engagement that performer's position took without extensive deliberation, because the alternative was turning down money for reasons that felt principled in the moment and impractical in retrospect. He signed the contract. He stood in front of cameras in clean environments and said the words that had been written for him. He represented, to the audiences who saw the resulting materials, a version of American life that was prosperous and stable and fully compatible with the idea of underground survival as a reasonable next step rather than a desperate one. He was good at his job. The materials were effective. What Cooper Howard understood, in the part of himself, that he did not bring into the contract meetings, was that the world he was being paid to present as stable was not stable. That the calculations his family was making about schools, about neighborhoods, about futures, were calculations that people made when the ground was shifting underneath them, and the official version of events was not accounting for it. He was not unique in this understanding. Most people living in American cities in the late 2060s and early 2070s had developed the same quiet awareness, the same gap between what they were told and what they could see with their own eyes. Vault-Tec was selling to that gap. The fear that lived there, unnamed and unaddressed by any official communication, was exactly what the company had been built to monetize. Cooper Howard's face, calm and reassuring in the promotional materials, was one of the instruments the company used to convert that fear into compliance. He would have years, in the form they gave him, to consider what he had contributed to. The activation phase began in 2072, without announcement or ceremony. Vaults that had stood complete and empty for years, their systems maintained on standby power, began receiving the deliveries and personnel that would transform them from finished structures into operational facilities. The logistics of this process were considerable. Food stores rated for decades of use arrived at vault sites in unmarked transport vehicles, operating on schedules that were not published in any accessible record. Medical equipment was installed and calibrated by technicians, working under the highest classification levels the project carried. Power systems were brought from standby to full operational status. The human element of the activation phase was managed with the same compartmentalization that had characterized every other aspect of the program. Overseers, the men and women who would hold authority over each vault's population from the moment the door sealed, received their final training through a curriculum that described their role with careful accuracy, while omitting any detail about the experimental parameters their facilities had been built around. They learned population management, resource allocation under scarcity conditions, conflict resolution in confined environments, the maintenance of institutional authority across generational transitions. Overseers assigned to experimental facilities received an additional component to their training package, a set of sealed orders delivered in physical form, with instructions to open them at specific intervals after the vault closed. The intervals were staggered, some orders to be opened within the first year, others not until the second decade, others designated for the overseer's successor, rather than their original recipient. The covering documentation described these orders as standard operational protocols, essential supplements to the training materials that addressed scenarios too specific to cover in general preparation. None of the overseers were told what the orders contained. A woman named Sandra Flores, assigned as overseer to a vault in the southeastern region, described her final training week in a personal journal that she kept throughout the process. "The facilities are impressive," she wrote. "The people running the program seem genuinely committed to making this work. I feel prepared. The sealed orders make me curious but not concerned. There are obviously operational details that don't need to be covered in general training." She packed the sealed envelope into her official kit alongside the technical manuals and the population roster and the keys to the facility she would be responsible for managing for the foreseeable future. She had been selected for her administrative competence, her psychological stability, and her demonstrated capacity for institutional loyalty. She had all three qualities in abundance. She had been given no reason to apply them critically to the institution asking for them. The representative who covered the Sanctuary Hills area of Massachusetts had been with Vault-Tec for 11 years when the final rounds began. His territory included a residential neighborhood of modest houses on a cul-de-sac, a community that had the particular quality of places where people had chosen to settle with the intention of staying. Maintained lawns, children's bicycles left on driveways, the small accumulation of evidence that people were investing in a future in that specific location. He had visited most of the families on his list multiple times. He knew their names, their children's names, the particular concerns that each household brought to the question of vault placement. His final visits in the weeks before October were confirmation calls, verifying admission details, distributing orientation packets, answering the questions that families had accumulated since their initial application. He answered those questions with the warmth and precision of someone who knew the material thoroughly and believed in its importance. He recommended what to pack and what to leave behind. He explained what the first days in the vault would look like and how the orientation process worked. He told them, because it was true and because people needed to hear it, that the families who had been confirmed for this particular facility were good people who would take care of each other. He did not know the full nature of what Vault 111 had been built to do. The cryogenic systems in the facility's lower levels, the pods that would suspend its residents in frozen stasis for a duration that its programming had never been designed to limit, were outside the information he had been given access to. He knew it was a priority facility. He knew its residents were confirmed. He knew his job was to ensure they arrived prepared and at peace. He would survive the war in a form he had not anticipated. 2 centuries later, the families he had confirmed into Vault 111 would be either dead or frozen, and he would still be making his way through a world that had forgotten almost everything he had once known, except the habit of doing his job. But in those final weeks, moving from door to door in a neighborhood that smelled of autumn leaves and someone's dinner cooking, he was simply a man who believed he was helping. That belief had been given to him with great care and never examined by the people who provided it. Hank McLean's office on the upper floors of Vault-Tec's regional headquarters had a view of the Los Angeles basin that on clear days extended to the horizon. He was not a man who expressed doubt in professional settings, and the professional settings were the ones that mattered for the purposes of the institution he served. His career had been built on a specific combination of qualities: administrative precision, ideological clarity, the capacity to hold a complex institutional framework in his mind without becoming confused by its internal contradictions. He had risen through Vault-Tec's hierarchy by being genuinely good at what the hierarchy valued, and what it valued was the ability to see the program as it understood itself, rather than as it might appear to someone outside. The Vault-Tec executive class that Hank represented had not arrived at their positions through coercion or conspiracy in any dramatic sense. They had been recruited, trained, promoted, and developed through an institutional culture that rewarded specific qualities and discouraged others, that framed its mission in terms that made the work feel not merely acceptable but necessary. They believed they were saving humanity, the selection of which humans to save, and under what conditions, and toward what ends. These were details that the institutional framework absorbed and neutralized through layers of language that made decisions feel like science rather than choices. Hank had a family. He had commitments outside the institution that he honored with the same reliability he brought to his professional obligations. He was, by any ordinary measure, a decent person operating within a system that had been designed to make decent people capable of indecent things without requiring them to think of themselves as indecent while doing them. His sealed orders for Vault 33 were in his office safe. He had not opened them. He did not need to. He had been involved in the design of certain parameters at a level that most overseers had not. He understood the connected vault structure, the interbreeding protocols, the long-term population management framework that Vault 33 was positioned within. He understood that his role was not simply to shelter his residents, but to maintain a specific kind of community across the generational timeline that the program had established. He understood this and found it reasonable because the framework that surrounded it had been constructed specifically to make it feel that way. The Enclave's own arrangements were not complicated because they had been planned with a thoroughness that complexity would have endangered. An oil platform off the California coast had been converted over many years into a fully self-sufficient installation. Power generation, food production, water supply, living quarters, research facilities, communication infrastructure. Its existence was classified at levels that placed it outside every oversight structure that might have raised questions about its purpose. The personnel assigned to it were not Vault residents. They were not lottery winners. They were the people who had decided, in the sealed upper levels of the institutional framework that ran the Vault program, what the Vault residents would experience. The separation was the point. The laboratory and the observation room could not occupy the same space. The experiment required distance between the people being studied and the people doing the studying. When the bombs fell, Vault-Tec's public face, the overseers, the representatives, the administrative personnel who had been positioned at Vault sites, would be inside the facilities alongside the populations they managed. The institution's actual core would be elsewhere, insulated from the consequences of its own decisions by a distance measured in miles of open water. There were also hardened government bunkers, positioned at intervals across the continent, carrying the essential records and personnel of an institutional continuity that had been planning for this moment since before most of its current members had been recruited. The Enclave's post-war plans were detailed and specific. They described the timeline for surface re-emergence. They described the process for implementing the reconstruction framework that the Vault experiment data would inform. They described the kind of world that would be built, and by whom, and under what authority. Those plans were not shared with anyone inside the vaults. In the final weeks of October 2077, certain patterns became visible to anyone paying close attention, though almost nobody was positioned to see enough of the pattern to understand what it indicated. Senior Vault-Tec personnel began taking extended leave from regional offices in numbers that exceeded normal scheduling. Asset transfers appeared in financial records that would later be examined by people with more time and better access than the situation currently permitted. Corporate vehicles were relocated from urban facilities to positions nearer vault sites, a logistical adjustment that was documented as routine equipment maintenance. The Intelligence Division's final internal report, distributed to a list that had been reduced to its essential recipients, assessed the probability of nuclear exchange within 30 days at 93%. The methodology behind that figure was sound. The people who received it acted on it immediately. The families on the confirmation lists were not told. The assessment was not shared with the government officials whose funding had built the vaults and whose public endorsement had made them possible. The Vault-Tec representatives making their final rounds in neighborhoods across the country, confirming names, distributing orientation packets, answering questions about what to pack, were not told. A representative in Ohio named Michael Tran made his last scheduled visit on the evening of October 21st, 2 days before the bombs fell. He drove home afterward, thinking about a family he had confirmed that morning, a couple in their 30s with a young son, who had asked him whether they should bring their dog. He had told them the vault's regulations on animals were specific and that he was sorry, but the answer was no. The mother had nodded and thanked him for being direct. The father had picked up the dog and held it for a long moment before putting it down. Michael Tran filed his completion report that evening and submitted it to the regional office. The regional office was already operating with a skeleton crew. The report was received by automated systems that logged it without any human review. He did not know that the families he had just confirmed were the last ones, that the visits were done, that the people who had sent him to those doors had already moved to positions that placed them beyond the reach of whatever was coming. The certainty he had been selling, the calm assurance that the future had been arranged, that protection was in place, that someone was handling it, had been abandoned by the people who manufactured it weeks before it ran out. Outside, in cities and suburbs and small towns across the country, people went to sleep on the night of October 22nd, without knowing it was the last ordinary night they would have. They had been told they were prepared. They had been given a product to attach their fear to. They had done everything the brochures recommended. The door to that Tuesday morning was already closing. The radio was playing at 6 in the morning when Margaret Cho made coffee in her kitchen in Columbus, Ohio. The signal came in clearly, a morning program she had listened to for years, familiar voices discussing the weather forecast and a local sports result, and the kind of small news that filled the space between music. Her husband was still sleeping. Her son had left early for school, his backpack hanging from one shoulder the way she had told him 100 times it should not. The coffee machine produced its usual sound. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled. Outside the window, the street was beginning its ordinary morning movement. A neighbor walking a dog, a delivery vehicle making its rounds, the slow accumulation of activity that marked the start of a day that felt, from every available signal, like any other. She poured a coffee and sat down and did not think about nuclear war, because the morning gave her no reason to. Across the country, in cities and suburbs and small towns, the machinery of October 23rd, 2077 was running at full capacity. Traffic signals cycled through their sequences on empty early morning streets that would fill within the hour. School buses ran their routes. Office buildings received their first arrivals. Restaurants opened for breakfast service. The industrial and commercial infrastructure of a civilization that had been building itself for centuries continued its operations with the indifferent persistence of systems that did not require intention to function. At Vault-Tec's regional offices, the skeleton crews that remained after the quiet departures of the preceding weeks ran their final system checks with the focused efficiency of people who understood that their work was nearly complete. Status reports moved through encrypted channels to recipients who were already positioned in facilities that the reports confirmed were operational. The receptionist at the company's main administrative building in Los Angeles, a young woman who had been with the organization for less than a year, whose name appeared on no Vault assignment list, answered her phones and directed calls to extensions that forwarded to automated systems, because the people those extensions had once connected to were no longer in the building. She did not know this. She assumed they were simply unavailable, as people sometimes were on busy mornings. She made a note to follow up on several messages that would never be returned. The morning moved through its ordinary paces. By 9 o'clock, Margaret Cho had finished her coffee and was preparing to leave for work. The radio was still playing. At 9:42 a.m. Eastern Time, the emergency broadcast system activated simultaneously across every frequency. The sound was not subtle. Emergency broadcast tones had been designed specifically to be impossible to ignore, to penetrate sleep, to interrupt conversation, to cut through the ambient noise of daily life in a way that left no possibility of mistaking what was happening. In living rooms and cars and offices and school classrooms, the familiar pattern of tones replaced whatever had been playing and was followed by the automated voice that everyone who had grown up in the atomic age had heard in drills but never in earnest. In most places, there was a moment of stillness before the movement began. The response at vault sites varied in ways that reflected the information each location had received and the preparation each overseer had been given time to complete. A small number of facilities had been admitting residents since the previous evening. Overseers who had been reached through informal channels by people with access to information that was not being shared officially. These vaults processed their populations with the organized calm of procedures that had been rehearsed. Families were checked against lists, assigned to quarters, guided through orientation sequences that the staff had run enough times to deliver without visible stress. The doors had been standing open since midnight. Other facilities scrambled. At a vault site outside Denver, the overseer received the emergency activation signal at 9:44 a.m. and began the admission process with 20 minutes of preparation and a 20 population roster that had been intended for an orderly daytime arrival. What appeared at the vault entrance was not orderly. Families arrived in vehicles that had been loaded in minutes, carrying whatever had been within reach when the broadcast started. A man in a bathrobe, a woman with a child on her hip, and a second child running ahead of her, an elderly couple who had driven 40 minutes from the wrong direction before finding the right road. The security team worked through the list with the speed that the situation required, checking names against assignments, while the line behind the checked families grew longer and louder. People whose names were not on the list did not receive a different answer because of how urgently they asked. The capacity was fixed. The roster had been finalized months earlier. A family of 5 who lived 2 streets from the vault entrance and had simply never applied because they had not believed it would come to this, because the lottery had seemed abstract, because something had always seemed more pressing than filling out the paperwork, stood at the back of the line, and then at the front of the line, and then outside a door that was beginning its closing sequence. The list was the list. It had always been the list. The morning had simply made that fact unavoidable. The families from Sanctuary Hills arrived at Vault 111 in the middle of the morning, some of them still in the clothes they had worn to bed, moving with the particular urgency of people who had packed faster than they had planned. The vault entrance was set into a hillside above the neighborhood, accessible by an elevator platform that the representative had shown them during the orientation visit weeks earlier. The staff at the entrance processed admissions with a calm that the arriving families found reassuring. The calm of people who had been expecting this, who had a procedure and were following it. Names were checked, identification was verified, personal items were logged. The orientation language was warm and direct. Everything was going to be fine. The facility was fully operational. The decontamination procedure was a precaution and would take only a few minutes. The decontamination procedure involved walking into a sealed pod. The pods were arranged in a lower level of the facility, a room that the staff described as the processing area. They were white and smooth, their interiors fitted with supports that held the body in a specific position, their doors sealing with a soft pressure that a person might interpret as the snug security of something designed to protect them. The staff who guided residents into the pods maintained their warmth and their calm throughout. It is just a precaution, they said. Standard procedure for all new residents. You will be out and settled into your quarters before the afternoon. A woman named Susan placed her daughter into a pod and watched the door seal and told her daughter that it would only be a few minutes. Her daughter had fallen asleep almost immediately. The system worked quickly, and the daughter was small. Susan stepped into the adjacent pod and watched through the narrowing gap of the door as the staff member who had guided her checked something on a terminal and made a note. The staff member looked up and met her eyes and smiled. Susan nodded. The frost formed on the inside of the glass before she finished the thought she had been in the middle of. She would not finish it for nearly 200 years. Most of the people in the room around her would not finish anything at all. The system, failures and power fluctuations that would accumulate across the following decades, would end some of the pod's functions before their occupants could be recovered. But in that moment, in the few seconds before the cold took consciousness, the room was simply quiet and white and full of people who believed they had made it. The experiment had begun. Its first data point was the expression on Susan's face as her eyes closed. The particular mixture of exhaustion and relief of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has finally been given permission to stop. Beneath Bakersfield, the door to Vault 12 completed most of its closing sequence. The gear mechanism rotated through its full arc, the locking teeth engaged in their designed positions along the frame. The systems that were supposed to verify a complete seal registered the door as closed because the tolerance variance that had been engineered into the mechanism fell within the parameters. Those systems had been calibrated to accept as closed. From the perspective of every instrument the vault possessed, the door was sealed. The gap was the width of a finger at its widest point, and considerably narrower at its narrowest. It ran along the lower right quadrant of the door's circumference, in the section where the sealing gasket had been installed, with the variance that Dennis Ware had flagged in his notes 2 decades earlier and been told not to question. To the residents standing in the entrance corridor, moving through the admission process, carrying their permitted belongings, and looking for the faces of their assigned neighbors, it was invisible. The lighting in the entrance corridor did not fall on that section of the door in a way that would have revealed anything unusual, even to someone specifically looking. Nobody was specifically looking. The door appeared closed. The staff had confirmed the door was closed. The admission process continued. In the hours that followed the detonations, as the radiation levels in the atmosphere above Bakersfield rose to the ranges that the bombs produced, a portion of that radiation found the gap. The amounts that entered were small, small enough that no person in the vault would have felt anything, would have identified any sensation, would have had any reason to connect the slight increase in their background exposure to a physical cause. The monitoring systems that would have detected this increase had been calibrated to the same tolerance as the ceiling verification systems. The children playing in the common areas that evening were unaware of it. The adults organizing the first night's duty rosters were unaware of it. The overseer reviewing the facility's status reports, confirming that all systems showed normal, was unaware of it. The experiment was running exactly as designed. Vault 87 sealed correctly, completely, without incident. The residents gathered in the common areas, in the hours after closing, drawn together by the particular gravity of people who have just survived something enormous and need to confirm that they have survived it by seeing other faces doing the same. Someone had located a cache of rationed beverages that the admission staff had set aside for this occasion. People stood in small groups and spoke in the lower registers that extreme relief sometimes produces, the voices of people who are not yet ready to be loud about anything. The sealed corridor behind the medical bay was not visible from the common areas. The door that separated it from the residential sections was marked with the same restricted maintenance signage that appeared on several other doors in the facility, and it attracted no particular attention. The equipment behind it had been in place for years. Its systems were drawing power from the vault's main supply and maintaining operational temperature and confirming their own readiness through automated checks that reported to a terminal in the overseer's office. The overseer reviewed the status report that evening and noted that all systems were showing normal. The restricted maintenance section was listed as operational. He did not have access to the documentation that described what operational meant for that section, because that documentation had not been included in his training package. He noted it in his log as confirming that all vault systems were functioning as intended and moved on to the next item. The residents finished their beverages and went to their assigned quarters and lay down in the first night of what most of them believed would be a temporary stay. A man in dormitory 4 told his bunkmate that he figured they would be back on the surface within a year. His bunkmate agreed that a year seemed reasonable. They talked for a while in the dark and then fell silent. The FV chambers waited in their sealed corridor with the patience of things that have no reason to be impatient. Between 9:42 and 11:59 a.m. on October 23rd, 2077, the world ended. Not in any metaphorical sense, in the direct, physical sense of a civilization's material infrastructure being destroyed faster than any recovery process could follow. Nuclear warheads reached their targets across the continental United States in sequences that radar systems tracked and logged, and that the surviving records would later allow analysts to reconstruct with considerable precision. The strikes were not random. They followed targeting logic developed by military planners who had been doing their jobs with professional thoroughness for decades, aimed at the nodes of infrastructure and command and population density, whose destruction would most effectively eliminate an adversary's capacity to continue functioning. Cities were destroyed. The word was accurate but insufficient. The physical structures that a century of construction had accumulated, the buildings, the roads, the power grids, the water systems, the communication networks, the industrial facilities, were reduced in a matter of hours to states that bore no functional relationship to what they had been that morning. The ecosystems that had sustained life across the continent were contaminated at depths that would take generations to partially clear. The atmospheric conditions produced by the exchange would alter weather patterns for years. 2 billion people died within the first week. The number was not an estimate derived from modeling. It was an outcome. The world that Vault-Tec had spent decades preparing for had arrived. The projections had been accurate. The timeline had been within the range the intelligence division had calculated. The vaults were sealed. The experiments were active. The populations inside them were beginning the first hours of lives that had been designed for them by people who were now elsewhere, in facilities that the bombs had not reached, monitoring the status of 122 sealed structures through communication systems that were still functioning. In the silence that followed the last detonation, the surface was ash and heat, and the particular quality of stillness that descends when all the sounds that had previously filled a space have been permanently removed. Nothing moved that was not moved by wind. Nothing spoke that had not been programmed to speak without human direction. The final transmission on Vault-Tec's encrypted internal network was logged at 2:17 p.m. Eastern Time. The preceding hours had carried the expected traffic. Status confirmations from vault sites, automated system reports from facilities whose overseers had followed their activation protocols, brief coded acknowledgements from personnel who had reached their designated positions. The network had been designed to survive nuclear bombardment, its signal routed through hardened relay infrastructure that the strikes had not reached, and it had performed as designed. The final transmission originated from a source logged in the network records as central operations. It was short. Scenario confirmed, it read. Preservation protocol active. Monitoring begins. No sender identification beyond the source designation. No elaboration. No expression of anything that might be described as human response to the event the transmission was acknowledging. The language was the language of a system reporting that it had reached an expected state. The tone of a checklist item being marked complete. The network received the transmission, logged it, and distributed it to the designated recipient list. Acknowledgement signals returned from the positions that were still active. Then the traffic stopped, and the network continued to function in the absence of anything to carry, its encrypted channels open and operational and silent. Vault-Tec had not ended with the bombs. The bombs had been the beginning of what the company had spent 46 years preparing to begin. The corporation's public existence, the offices, the representatives, the promotional materials, the congressional testimony, the lottery broadcasts, had been the mechanism for reaching this moment. The moment had arrived exactly as planned. What came after was not an ending. It was the activation of everything that had been built in the years before. The vaults hummed in the dark beneath the ruined surface. Their systems ran. Their populations breathed recycled air and slept in assigned quarters and woke to the first of the days that would become the rest of their lives. Above them, the world that had sent them there was gone. The experiment had been waiting a long time for this. The first child born inside Vault 101 arrived 11 months after the door sealed. Her parents had been among the last residents, admitted on the morning of October 23rd, arriving at the entrance with 7 minutes to spare before the closing sequence began. Her father had carried 2 bags, and her mother had carried nothing except the particular stillness of someone who had stopped being afraid, because there was no longer any point in it. They had been assigned quarters in the residential East Wing. They had eaten their first vault meal that evening at a table with 4 strangers who would become, over the following years, the closest thing to extended family that their circumstances permitted. The child was born in the medical bay on a September morning, delivered by a physician who had been doing this work on the surface for 20 years, and found that the fundamentals translated perfectly to underground conditions. The vault's population gathered in the corridor outside and passed the news along in the particular way that good news travels in enclosed spaces, quickly, with a warmth that the occasion genuinely warranted. A birth in Vault 101 meant something specific. It meant the community was not simply enduring, it was continuing. What that child would never have, what no child born in Vault 101 would ever have, was a frame of reference for the concept of outside. The Vault's operational directive was singular and absolute. The facility was never to open. The instruction had been embedded in the overseer's sealed orders and in the programming of the facility's core systems, with an equal weight so that neither human authority nor automated function could easily override the other. The reasoning behind it, from the perspective of the experiment's designers, was straightforward. Absolute isolation produced a controlled variable. A vault that opened, even once, even briefly, introduced contamination into the dataset. The experiment required a population with no external contact across its full generational span. The directive had been written to ensure that requirement was met, regardless of what the overseer or the residents might eventually want. The overseer who received those orders read them on the 7th day after closing, as instructed, in the privacy of the office that came with the position. The document was clear. The facility was not to open under any circumstances. Residents who attempted to leave were to be prevented. The reasoning offered in the document was framed in terms of radiation safety and population. Security. The surface remained too dangerous, the vault too valuable to risk. The overseer found this reasoning persuasive because the surface was genuinely dangerous and the vault genuinely valuable, and because the framing had been designed with care to be persuasive to exactly this kind of person in exactly this kind of situation. Over the following decades, the prohibition on leaving became something more than policy. It became the vault's moral foundation. 3 levels below the Las Vegas desert, the residents of Vault 21 had been running for approximately 6 months when the first serious dispute arose over water ration allocation. The dispute was between 2 families in the residential south section who had adjacent quarters and incompatible opinions about what constituted fair distribution of the supplemental ration that the Vault systems released on a weekly basis. Under any conventional governance structure, the dispute would have been referred to an authority, an overseer, a council, an arbitration system. Vault 21 had none of these. Its single operational rule was explicit and unambiguous. All disputes were to be resolved through gambling. The method of gambling was not specified. The requirement that the outcome be determined by chance was. The 2 families set up a card table in the common area. A third resident, who had no stake in the outcome but considerable experience with cards, agreed to deal. A small audience gathered, not out of any particular investment in the water ration question, but because the mechanics of what was happening were interesting, in a way that the Vault's early weeks had not yet provided much of. The family that won the hand received the allocation. The family that lost accepted the outcome with a composure that surprised several observers who had expected resistance. When asked about it afterward, the father of the losing family said something that would be repeated in various forms throughout Vault 21's subsequent history. The cards didn't have a reason to favor either of us. That's as fair as anything gets. The logic embedded in that statement, that chance precisely because it was indifferent, was more trustworthy than any human judgment, became the philosophical foundation on which Vault 21's society was built, not through any deliberate effort, not through consensus or committee, but through the organic accumulation of a community, working out its own principles in real time. Children who grew up in the Vault absorbed the logic before they absorbed most other things. They learned probability the way children elsewhere learned arithmetic, as a fundamental tool for navigating the world, as necessary as language. The stability this produced was not what any outside observer would have predicted from the experiment's parameters. A society governed by chance should, in theory, be chaotic, unpredictable, prone to swings in fortune that destabilized whatever social structures attempted to form. What actually developed was something more nuanced. The element of chance functioned as a pressure valve. Grievances that might have calcified into permanent resentment were released through the legitimate outcome of a game. Status was real but temporary. Anyone could win. Anyone could lose. The next hand was always available. When Vault 21 eventually connected to the surface, to the neon and commerce of New Vegas, to the casino culture that the Mojave had built around games of chance and calculated risk, the continuity was not coincidental. The experiment had produced a population whose entire framework for understanding fairness, authority, and social contract ran through probability. They were, in a sense, ideally prepare the world they emerged into. Whether that preparation had been intended or had simply been an outcome the designers had not fully modeled was a question the records did not clearly answer. In the Mojave Desert, Vault 11 was entering its third generation. The first generation's volunteers were long gone, their names recorded in a memorial ledger that the Vault's residents maintained with the particular reverence that communities develop for the founders of painful traditions. The second generation had inherited the system as established fact, the way any generation inherits the arrangements made before it arrived. The third generation had grown up inside it, which was different in a way that the experiment's designers had specifically wanted to observe. A girl named Rosa had been born in Vault 11 14 years after the door sealed. By the time she was old enough to understand the annual selection, it had already been explained to her in the terms that her community used. Civic duty, collective survival, the mathematics of one life against the lives of everyone else. She had been taught this the way she had been taught everything else, by adults who believed it, because it was what they had been taught, by a culture that had spent 3 generations developing the language necessary to make it bearable. She was not without questions. The questions were there, persistent, specific, the kind that did not resolve themselves through repetition of the explanation. Why couldn't the system be changed? Why had no one tested whether the life support would actually fail? Why did some people's names appear on the campaign literature and others never did? She asked these questions in private to people she trusted and received the answers that the Vault's culture had developed for them. Patient, thorough answers that addressed the surface of the question without touching what was underneath it. The political machinery around the annual selection had grown considerably more sophisticated by the time Rosa came of age. There were organized factions with distinct philosophies about how the selection should be conducted. There were advocacy groups dedicated to ensuring that certain demographics were not disproportionately chosen. There were campaigns, canvassing, the full apparatus of democratic politics applied to the management of institutionalized killing. The Vault had produced, in 3 generations, a functional and in many ways, impressive political culture. It had simply aimed that culture at the wrong problem. The computer terminal in the facility's central operations room continued to make its annual announcement in the same calm, institutional voice it had used since the first year. The life support systems it described as dependent on the sacrifice showed no variation in their performance whether the sacrifice occurred or not, because the threat had never been real and the systems had never been connected to any mechanism that would have made it real. The announcement was a program. The program ran. The community responded to it as if it described a genuine constraint, because that was what 3 generations of cultural development had produced. The people who had written the program were gone. Their intentions had outlasted them by decades, encoded in a voice that never changed its tone, regardless of what it was saying. Vault 76 opened its door on a morning in 2102, and the residents who walked out into Appalachia had been preparing for that moment for 25 years. The preparation had been genuine and thorough. Medical training covered radiation exposure treatment, wound management without full hospital resources, long-term nutritional deficiency identification and correction. Engineering courses addressed infrastructure reconstruction from whatever materials a post-war environment might provide. improvised power generation, water purification from contaminated sources, structural repair using salvaged components. Agricultural training covered soil remediation, seed preservation, and the management of growing cycles in environments where the pre-war assumptions about weather and soil chemistry no longer applied. The residents who emerged were, by the metrics that the preparation had been designed to produce, ready. Appalachia was not what they had prepared for. The scorched plague had moved through the region in the years following the war and left behind a landscape that none of the Vault's training scenarios had modeled. The scorch beasts, vast irradiated creatures whose presence indicated the plague's most severe concentrations, circulated through the mountains in patterns that made certain routes impassable at certain times. The responder network that had organized surface survivors in the decades after the bombs had collapsed, its members gone in ways that the physical evidence at their fair former positions did not fully explain. The Free States communities that had built themselves in the years before the Vault opened had their own histories, their own politics, their own assessments of who the Vault's 76 residents were and what their arrival meant. The plan that the residents had carried out of the Vault was not useless. It was simply aimed at a situation that did not exist. What replaced it was something less organized and more adaptive. The practical application of solid preparation to unexpected conditions, which was harder than following a plan, and in many ways more valuable than having followed one. The outside world had been building its own knowledge for 25 years. The Vault residents had been preserving the knowledge of a world that no longer existed. The exchange between those two bodies of understanding, the preserved and the adapted, would take years to complete and would produce something that neither side had arrived with. The servers that stored Vault-Tec's monitoring data ran without interruption in the years after the bombs. They were housed in hardened facilities designed to survive the electromagnetic effects of nuclear detonation, connected to power systems that drew from geothermal sources, requiring no surface infrastructure, maintained by automated diagnostic routines that identified and corrected minor failures without human oversight. The data they received from the experimental vaults, arrived through encrypted relay networks, was processed by algorithms that had been programmed to identify significant behavioral patterns and was stored in organized archives that would have been immediately legible to any analyst with the appropriate clearance. No analyst with the appropriate clearance reviewed them. The Enclave's own post-war situation had developed complications that its planning documents had not fully accounted for. The distance between its facilities and the Vault network, maintained deliberately to preserve the separation between observer and observed, had become a practical obstacle as well as a design principle. The organization that had commissioned the experiments was occupied with its own survival and its own internal fractures in the decades after the war. The Vault monitoring data accumulated in its servers with the patient indifference of information that has been collected without anyone to read it. In Vault 87, the behavioral monitoring system logged the first anomalous physical indicators in the population. 3 weeks after the FEV exposure, protocols began. The data was transmitted, processed, archived. In Vault 11, the political developments around the annual selection were recorded in granular detail. Voting patterns, campaign rhetoric, the shifting coalitions of each generational cycle. In Vault 12, the progressive biometric changes in the population were tracked against the radiation exposure models and the divergences between projected and actual transformation rates were noted in automated flags that appeared in the archive and were never reviewed. The surveillance outlasted the purpose it had been built to serve. The instruments kept measuring after the scientists had left the room. This was, in a specific and unintended sense, the truest expression of what Vault-Tec had always been. a system that continued to operate according to its original programming, regardless of whether the outcomes it was producing were serving anyone's interests. Not every vault produced data. Some produced only silence. A facility designed for a population twice its intended capacity had developed, in its first years, solutions to the pressure that its designers had considered the most likely outcomes. Improvised space management, complex scheduling systems, the kind of tight social organization that emerged when the physical environment left no room for inefficiency. The residents had been, by any measure, resourceful. They had adapted to conditions that should have been unlivable and built something that functioned. The food processors had not been designed for twice the load. They ran continuously, maintained by a population that understood their importance and prioritized their upkeep above almost everything else. They ran continuously for 11 years before the cumulative strain produced failures that the Vault's spare parts inventory could not fully address. The social structures that had managed scarcity through negotiation and established hierarchy had been built on the assumption that scarcity was manageable. When the processes failed and scarcity became something else, those structures had nothing left to negotiate with. The Vault's final logs were maintained by a resident who had been keeping records throughout. A former accountant from Cleveland who had understood from early on that documentation was the most useful thing she could contribute. Her entries in the final months were precise and clinical, describing the Vault's deterioration with the same dispassionate accuracy she had applied to its functioning periods. She had decided at some point that her records did not clearly identify, that if the situation could not be stopped, it could at least be accurately described. Her last entry was a single sentence. It noted the date, the current population count, and the status of the facility's remaining operational systems. Then it stopped. The way things stop when the person maintaining them is no longer able to continue. Another vault, given only 40-watt bulbs across all its lighting systems, had descended not into violence, but into a quieter dissolution. The depression that settled into its population over years of perpetual dim illumination had no dramatic expression. No conflict, no collapse, no moment that the monitoring systems flagged as a significant behavioral event. People simply became less active, less connected, less interested in the futures that required energy to build. The birth rate dropped. The maintenance routines that kept the facility functional were performed with decreasing thoroughness. The vault did not end. It faded, the way a sound fades when the source stops producing it, until what remained was too quiet to register as anything at all. In the vaults that worked, in Vault 8 and the handful of other control facilities, generations grew up with a specific and genuinely held understanding of who they were and what they were for. They were the preserved, the ones who had made it through. Their vault was civilization's lifeboat, maintained in careful readiness against the day when the surface would be ready to receive what they had, kept alive. Their purpose was not simply to survive, but to remember, to hold the knowledge and the values and the institutional memory of a world that was gone, so that the world being built above them would have something worth inheriting. A teacher in Vault 8 named James Okafor spent 30 years of his professional life in the Vault's educational program. His approach to the material, the pre-war history, the scientific knowledge, the civic principles that the program had been designed to preserve, was shaped by a conviction that he considered the most important thing he could communicate to his students. You are not merely waiting, he told each new cohort. You are keeping something alive that would otherwise be lost. The distinction matters. His students believed him, but because the evidence around them supported the belief. The vault worked. The systems functioned. The community was stable. The promise that Vault-Tec had made. Preservation through the catastrophe, emergence into a world that could use what had been kept, seemed, from inside Vault 8, like a promise that was being kept. They were the smallest fraction of the network. They were the ones whose experience matched the brochure. They carried their preserved knowledge forward with the earnestness of people who had been given a genuine mission and had taken it seriously throughout. What they could not have known from inside their functional facility, with its clean water and adequate food stores and working medical systems, was the full character of the institution that had placed them there. They knew the promise. They did not know what the promise had been used to cover. That knowledge was waiting for them outside. Some doors opened on schedule, as if the world outside had simply been waiting for the appointment. Others were forced by residents who had decided, after decades or generations of sealed living, that the directive keeping them underground had less authority than the directive keeping them alive. Others opened because the systems maintaining them had failed in ways that left no alternative. A small number never opened at all, either because their operational systems continued to function without interruption across the full span of what followed, or because there was no one left inside capable of operating the mechanism. Each opening was its own event, shaped entirely by what the specific facility had experienced during its sealed years. A control vault producing its residents into daylight after a generation of genuine preservation sent out people who were healthy, educated, and carrying institutional knowledge that the surface had lost. People who were, in almost every measurable sense, prepared, and who discovered within their first weeks outside that the preparation they had was for a world that no longer existed in the form they had studied. An experimental vault releasing its survivors. If releasing was the right word for what sometimes happened, sent out populations shaped by decades of engineered conditions into a surface environment that had no framework for what those conditions had produced. The wasteland that received these populations had been building itself for generations without any vault involvement. It had developed its own knowledge systems, its own social structures, its own hard-won understanding of how to exist in an environment that the bombs had transformed beyond the ability of pre-war maps to describe. The communities scattered across the irradiated landscape, the settlements growing in the ruins of cities, the trading networks threading between them, the factions accumulating authority through different combinations of force and ideology, had arrived at their current states through processes that owed nothing to anything Vault-Tec had planned. When Vault populations entered this world, what happened next depended on what each group brought and what the surface was prepared to do with it. The water chip that sent the first Vault dweller into the wasteland in 2161 was a standard component. It regulated the recycling system that Vault 13 depended on for its water supply. A critical piece of equipment that had been functioning without replacement for 84 years, longer than its design specifications had predicted, long enough that the Vault's supply of backup components had been exhausted, without anyone having occasion to notice the deficit until the chip began, showing the first indicators of failure. The overseer who assigned the mission framed it as a straightforward procurement task. Find a replacement, return within 150 days. The Vault dweller who walked out of Vault 13's entrance on that morning carried the full weight of a life lived entirely underground. The technical training that Vault education had provided was genuine and thorough. The maintenance protocols, the mechanical knowledge, the understanding of pre-war systems that most surface communities had lost the capacity to repair. The social training was equally genuine and equally specific to conditions that no longer applied. How to navigate institutional hierarchies, how to operate within established procedures, how to address authority. These were skills that had been developed in a sealed environment, and that the open irradiated landscape stretching in every direction had no use for in their original form. Shady Sands was the first settled community the Vault dweller encountered. a modest collection of buildings and people who had been building something functional from the ruins of the pre-war world, with the tools and knowledge available to them, which were considerably fewer than what a Vault-educated person carried, but had been applied with the practical ingenuity that only direct necessity produced. The people there knew things the Vault Dweller did not know. The Vault Dweller knew things they did not know. The exchange between those two bodies of knowledge, brief and practical, and conducted under the pressure of a 150-day deadline, was a small version of the larger exchange that would define the relationship between Vault populations and surface communities for the following century. The journey through the ruins of California, through Junktown's commerce and conflict, through the hub's sprawling trade networks, through Necropolis, where the transformed population of Vault 12 had built a community around their altered existence, moved the Vault Dweller progressively further from anything that Vault education had prepared them for. Each community operated by principles developed from its own specific history. Each set of rules had been written by the experience of surviving conditions that no pre-war planning document had modeled. The Master's army, encountered at the end of the journey's most difficult arc, was the most direct collision of Vault-Tec's consequences that the wasteland had yet produced. The supermutants whose transformation had originated in Vault 87's FE chambers had become, under the Master's direction, an organized force pursuing a vision of forced human evolution that carried the same institutional logic as the experiment that had created them, the conviction that human biology required correction, that the people conducting the correction had the authority to conduct it, that the subjects of the correction did not require consultation. The Vault Dweller who faced this force had been produced by one part of Vault-Tec's program. The force itself had been produced by another. The people who had designed both were long dead. Their designs were still running. What Vault 8 produced, given a century and a geck, was a city. Vault City stood in the Nevada landscape as evidence of what genuine preservation looked like when it was given time and resources. Clean streets, functioning power infrastructure, medical technology that exceeded anything available elsewhere in the Western Territories, a standard of material living that most surface communities would not approach for generations. The descendants of the people who had walked out of Vault 8 with their geck and their preserved knowledge had built something that the pre-war world would have recognized as civilization. They had also built walls. The insularity that characterized Vault City by the mid-23rd century was not incidental to its success. It was produced by the same source. A community that had survived and flourished because it possessed advantages unavailable to the world around it had developed across the generations, an understanding of itself as fundamentally distinct from that world. Citizens were citizens. The people outside the walls were outsiders, tolerated at specific entry points under specific conditions, useful for trade and labor but not candidates for the full membership that the community reserved for the descendants of the original Vault population. The specific cruelties that accompanied this arrangement, the indentured labor practices, the medical care withheld from non-citizens who arrived at the city's gates, in states that Vault City's facilities could have treated without difficulty, the elaborate procedural barriers erected against any path to citizenship that might allow the surrounding population to access what the city had were not aberrations from Vault City's values. They were expressions of them. The Vault program had preserved a specific population with specific advantages and had created, through that act of preservation, a community that understood its advantages as entitlements rather than accidents. The geck had transformed irradiated soil into productive land. The productive land had supported a growing community. The growing community had looked at the world around it and decided that the distance between itself and that world was a feature rather than a problem to be addressed. Vault-Tec had built the container. The contents had filled it in ways that reflected the logic of preservation, taken to its natural conclusion. The Chosen One left Arroyo in 2241, looking for a device that could restore fertility to dying soil. The village that had grown from the Vault Dwellers' descendants had been living as a tribal community for 3 generations, far enough from the Vault's origins that the institutional knowledge of that world had faded into cultural practice rather than operational skill. The Gek they needed existed somewhere in the wasteland. Finding it required traveling into regions that Arroyo's experience had not prepared its residents to navigate through communities and factions whose histories were entirely separate from anything the village's oral tradition recorded. What the Chosen One found at the end of a journey that took them across the full breadth of the Western Wasteland was the Enclave, the organization that had commissioned the Vault experiments, that had separated itself from the populations it intended to study, that had spent the decades since the bombs maintaining its structure in an installation off the California coast, had developed across the intervening century into something that retained the ideology of its founders, while having lost much of their capacity for self-examination. The conviction that the Enclave represented legitimate governmental authority over the wasteland's population had not weakened with time. It had calcified. The flexibility that might have allowed the organization to adapt its methods to the reality it actually faced had been replaced by a rigidity that could only see the gap between its vision and the actual world as a problem in the world rather than in the vision. The post-war project they had developed extended the experiment matrix's logic to its furthest possible conclusion. The Vault populations had been subjected to controlled conditions to produce useful data. The wasteland population, the survivors and their descendants who had built their lives without any Vault protection, would be subjected to FEV, modification at a scale that would eliminate the variation the Enclave found incompatible with its reconstruction plans. The framing was the same framing that had justified every classified appendix and every sealed order and every door engineered to fail. The subjects required correction. The people conducting the correction had the authority to conduct it. The Chosen One dismantled this project, the means by which they did so, and the specific vulnerabilities they found in an organization that had spent a century becoming more certain of itself and less capable of being challenged from within, were the product of exactly the kind of adaptability that the wasteland had spent a century developing. The practical, flexible, improvisational intelligence of people who had learned to work with whatever was available rather than within whatever had been planned. The Enclave's plan had been designed by people believed that planning was sufficient. The person who ended it had been raised by people who knew it was not. 200 years after the door sealed, Vault 101 remained closed. The population that had grown up inside had no living member who remembered the surface. The grandchildren of the original residents had themselves become grandparents. The Vault's rules, including the prohibition that had been embedded in the overseer's original orders, and had passed from one administration to the next as foundational principle, had by this point achieved the status of moral law rather than institutional policy. Leaving was not merely forbidden. It was understood by most of the people inside as wrong in a way that did not require further explanation. A scientist named James left anyway in 2277 through a combination of technical knowledge and specific conviction that overrode both the rules and the authority enforcing them. His reasons were his own, rooted in a project begun before his departure, and requiring resources available only on the surface. His leaving was not an act of rebellion in any political sense. It was a practical decision. The Vault's response to it, the disruption, the enforcement actions, the crisis of authority that rippled through a community whose entire social structure had been built on the assumption that the door would never open, illustrated with precision what a century of absolute isolation had produced. The lone wanderer who followed James out carried that isolation into the open expanse of the capital wasteland like a second skin. The rules that had governed every interaction in Vault 101, the hierarchies, the procedures, the precise understanding of what behavior was acceptable and what was not, had no application in an environment where the people encountered at each settlement had written their own rules from their own experience. The adjustment was not a matter of learning new information. It was a matter of rebuilding the framework through which information was processed. The journey that followed took the lone wanderer through the full consequence of what had been built in the decades before the war, the super mutants originating from the Eastern FEV program. The remnants of the Enclave's East Coast operation, pursuing its reconstruction agenda with the same certainty that had characterized the organization since its founding. And eventually, Project Purity, the water purification system that James had left to complete, built around pre-war technology designed to provide clean water to the communities that had been living without reliable access to it for 2 centuries. The completion of Project Purity was not, in any comprehensive sense, a resolution of what Vault-Tec had done. It was a specific good thing accomplished in a landscape shaped by enormous harm. The clean water it produced reached people who had been living without it. That was real. It was limited. It was also in a way that nobody who experienced it would have described in these terms. Something that resembled, in the smallest and most partial way, the promise that had been on the brochure. 3 connected facilities in California had been designed as a single system. Vaults 31, 32, and 33 shared infrastructure at specific junction points, connected by corridors that allowed controlled movement between facilities under overseer authorization. The population distributed across the 3 vaults was managed with a precision that went beyond any standard vault operational protocol, interbreeding schedules, leadership succession planning, ideological cultivation, through educational systems that had been designed to produce specific values and specific loyalties in each generation of residents. The Buds program ran through this system like a thread through fabric. The pre-war inner circle that had designed the most sensitive elements of the Vault network had not simply planned for the program's continuation. They had arranged to oversee it personally, preserved in cryogenic suspension in Vault 31, waking at intervals to assess the community's development and make adjustments, then returning to suspension. The experiment was not running automatically, observed by systems that had outlasted their supervisors. This one had supervisors who had refused to be outlasted. Lucy McLean had grown up in Vault 33, with the understanding that her community was exactly what it appeared to be, a well-functioning Vault population maintaining itself through the post-war period, governed by an overseer succession that the Buds training program had been ensuring for as long as anyone could remember. The values she carried out of the Vault when she emerged into the California wasteland in 2296 were genuine. The optimism, the commitment to cooperation, the belief that problems could be addressed through good faith effort. These were not performances. They were the product of a lifetime of cultivation in an environment designed to produce precisely those qualities. The wasteland outside received them with the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that a world shaped by hard experience brought to the arrival of someone shaped by something else entirely. What Lucy encountered beyond the vault door was not simply a more difficult version of the life she had known. It was evidence that the life she had known had been constructed, that the clean optimism of Vault 33 was the output of a system, and that the system had purposes she had not been informed of. Her father's history, discovered in stages that the wasteland's various revelations provided, was the evidence she had not been given. The gap between what she had been told and what was true was the measure of what Vault-Tec had always done with the people it claimed to protect. What the vaults gave the wasteland, and what the wasteland gave the vaults in return, was not an even exchange, and it was not supposed to be. The technical knowledge carried by vault populations, the preserved engineering, the medical training, the agricultural methods, the institutional frameworks, was genuinely valuable to communities that had been rebuilding from almost nothing for generations. It accelerated certain kinds of development. It provided solutions to problems that surface communities had been managing through improvisation because no better approach had been available. The Vault educated people who integrated into wasteland communities, or who founded new ones, brought something real. What the wasteland provided in exchange was harder to name and more difficult to preserve, but in many respects more important. The adaptability that came from having spent a century working with what was available rather than what had been planned. The specific and practical intelligence of people who had learned that circumstances changed and that survival required changing with them. The social knowledge accumulated by communities that had been navigating genuine uncertainty rather than engineered conditions. The understanding of how trust was actually built rather than how it had been described in a pre-war civic education curriculum. The NCR growing from the settlement at Shady Sands, carrying the influence of the first Vault dwellers' passage through it, built a democratic republic that had no precedent in the post-war West. The Brotherhood of Steel, preserving technology under its own strict ideology, existed in specific reaction to what pre-war institutions had done with the technology they controlled. The communities and factions and settlements scattered across the continent were all, in different ways, building answers to questions that Vault-Tec's program had been designed to answer for them. The program had been designed to produce populations that emerged into a world already organized by the people who had observed them. The populations had emerged into a world that was organizing itself. The difference between those two outcomes was not a small one. Vault-Tec had spent decades constructing a mechanism for controlling what came after. What came after had built itself out of the materials available, which included the vault populations and their preserved knowledge, and the specific adaptations their specific ordeals had produced. The mechanism had run. The outcomes had been recorded in servers that hummed in the dark, but the world that developed from those outcomes had not been the world the mechanism was designed to produce. It had been something else, messier, more varied, less organized, and in ways that the planning documents had never modeled, more genuinely alive. The oil rig sat 12 miles off the California coast, and the people living on it had convinced themselves, across 3 generations, that this was a temporary arrangement. The original personnel who had relocated to the installation in the weeks before October 23rd had understood their position clearly. They were observers, withdrawn to a safe distance from the experiment they had commissioned, waiting for conditions to stabilize before implementing the reconstruction framework they had spent decades preparing. The waiting had a specific timeline in the early years. The radiation would clear within a certain period. The vault data would be collected and analyzed. The surface populations would be assessed. The enclave would emerge. The timeline extended, then extended again. The surface conditions that the original projections had described as temporary proved more persistent than the models had predicted. The vault monitoring data arrived in volumes that required more processing time than the analysts had anticipated. The reconstruction framework, reviewed against actual post-war conditions rather than projected ones, required revisions that each revision cycle revealed as insufficient. The waiting became the situation rather than the prelude to the situation, and the people doing the waiting became, across the following decades, a different kind of organization than the one that had boarded the installation before the bombs. What the enclave became in the century after the Great War was shaped by the specific conditions of its survival. Isolated, self-referential, cut off from the feedback that contact with the outside world would have provided. The ideology that had sustained the original membership calcified into something that the founders, pragmatic, calculating, genuinely convinced of their own rationality, would not have fully recognized. The conviction that the enclave represented, America's legitimate governing authority, had always been self-serving. In the original membership, that self-serving quality had been balanced by the practical intelligence of people who understood they were making a claim rather than stating a fact. In the third generation, the claim had become the fact, at least within the confines of the installation, because there was nobody inside to challenge it, and no meaningful contact with anything outside. A senior analyst named Colonel Autumn, reviewing the organization's operational files in the 2270s, noted in a private document that the gap between the enclave's self-description and its actual capabilities had grown to a size that operational planning needed to account for. The document was filed. It was not acted on. The institution had become too committed to its own version of itself to incorporate the assessment. The plan had outlasted the people who understood it well enough to revise it. What remained was the plan's shell, the language, the authority structure, the conviction, operating in the absence of the flexibility that had originally made those things functional. Shady Sands had been a modest settlement when the first vault dweller passed through it in 2161. A collection of buildings and people, competently organized, working with the materials available to build something that functioned under conditions that pre-war planning had never modeled. The vault dweller's passage through it, brief, practical, focused on the water chip mission, had left behind something harder to quantify than the specific knowledge exchanged. The encounter between someone carrying preserved institutional understanding and a community that had been building its own institutional understanding from scratch had produced, in the decades following, a particular kind of confidence in Shady Sands that its subsequent development drew from. The new California Republic that grew from that confidence, formalized in 2189 and expanding steadily through the 23rd century, was the most significant democratic government in the post-war Western territories. Its founding documents drew explicitly on pre-war civic frameworks that the vault-educated founders had preserved. Its institutional culture, the elected councils, the rule of law, the formal mechanisms for resolving disputes between communities, carried the traces of a political tradition that had survived the bombs inside sealed facilities and been brought out into a world that had been governing itself through cruder means. Vault 15's contribution was different in character. The facility had been designed around deliberate population mixing. 4 distinct cultural groups placed together with incompatible traditions and minimal institutional structure, the experiment testing how diversity and conflict resolved into either breakdown or adaptation. What it produced, after decades of friction and occasional violence, and the specific kind of learning that only sustained difficulty provided, was a population that had developed genuine facility with negotiation across difference. The tribes that emerged from Vault 15 and its vicinity carried that facility into the wasteland. Some of it found its way into the NCR's institutional culture, where the capacity to hold diverse constituencies in a single political framework was not a theoretical commitment, but a practiced skill. This was not what the experiment had been designed to produce. The designed outcome had been data on intergroup conflict dynamics. The actual outcome included a political tradition that would outlast any data archived by centuries. The gap between those two things was the gap between what institutions planned and what people built from the materials those institutions provided. Beneath the ruins of Boston, in tunnels and chambers that had been expanding since the years immediately following the war. The Institute had been conducting its work for 2 centuries, without any accountability to the world above. The organization had grown from the remnants of a pre-war research university. Faculty and graduate students who had survived the bombs in an underground facility and who had, in the decades following, made a specific choice about their relationship to the surface. They would study it. They would not integrate with it. The surface was a resource and an object of inquiry, not a community to be joined or assisted in any way that would compromise the purity of the observation. The synthetic human program that defined the Institute's reputation in the 23rd century. The creation of artificial people, indistinguishable from biological ones, deployed into surface communities for purposes that the Institute's leadership described in terms of research, and that the surface communities experiencing the replacements described in considerably more direct terms, was the fullest expression of this philosophy. The surface population was a subject population. Its members could be studied, replaced, manipulated, and returned to their communities in altered form, without any obligation to inform them of what had been done. The structural resemblance to the Vault experiment philosophy was not coincidental in any deep sense, though the Institute had not derived its methods from Vault-Tec's documentation. The resemblance existed because both institutions had arrived at the same place through the same logic. The logic that becomes available when a group of people with significant resources and capabilities removes itself from any meaningful accountability to the people affected by its decisions. The specific conclusions differed. The underlying permission structure was identical. A surface dweller named Amari, operating a memory extraction service in Diamond City, had spent years working with the psychological damage left by Institute replacements. People who had lost months or years of their lives to substitution and who carried the disorientation of that loss without any framework for understanding it. Her practice was the ground-level evidence of what the Institute's research produced, when measured in human terms rather than scientific ones. She did not have access to the Institute's internal justifications. She had access to what those justifications produced in the people who experienced their implementation. The difference between those two perspectives was considerable, and it was a difference that the Institute's sealed environment had been specifically designed to prevent its members from having to confront. Robert House had been alive, in one technical sense or another, for over 2 centuries. The life extension systems he had developed before the war, maintained through the Lucky 38 Casino's infrastructure, continuously updated by automated processes he had designed himself, had preserved his consciousness and enough of his biological function to allow him to direct operations in New Vegas from a sealed chamber that he had not left since before the bombs fell. He was, by 2281, the only person alive who had been an adult participant in the pre-war world that had produced Vault-Tec, the Enclave, and everything that followed. His knowledge of that world was not sentimental. House had understood, in the pre-war period, exactly what the organizations around him were doing, and had made specific choices about his own position relative to them. His partnership with Vault-Tec through Robco's technology contracts had been a business relationship conducted with clear eyes. He had provided systems, received payment, and maintained the separation between his own interests and the institution's classified purposes that allowed him to function as a partner without assuming responsibility for what the partnership enabled. Whether that separation was genuine or convenient was a question his surviving documentation did not resolve. New Vegas was his post-war project in the most literal sense, a city he had preserved through targeted missile defense systems during the war, and rebuilt around the casino infrastructure that the pre-war world had left intact. The Securitrons patrolling the Strip the carefully managed balance between the NCR and Caesar's legion that kept the city from being absorbed by either the long-term plan that House described to anyone he trusted enough to describe it to in terms that extended centuries into the future. All of it reflected the same quality that had defined his pre-war career. He planned at timescales that other people found difficult to take seriously, and he had the patience to execute plans at those timescales, because he had arranged to still be alive when the relevant milestones arrived. The courier who entered his story in 2281 encountered someone who was simultaneously the last artifact of the pre-war world and one of the most active shapers of the post-war one, a person whose survival had given him a perspective on the full arc of what had happened that nobody else possessed, and whose plans for what came next were as confident and as comprehensive and as indifferent to the interests of people who had not been consulted as anything Vault-Tec had ever produced. Whether that made him the most dangerous person in the wasteland, or simply the most prepared one, was a question that the Mojave's various interested parties spent considerable energy attempting to answer. Vault 81 was still operating in 2287, which was itself a kind of answer to a question that most people in the Commonwealth had stopped asking. The facility outside the ruins of Boston had maintained functional water recycling, working medical systems, and a stable population through 2 centuries of post-war conditions that had ended most comparable institutions considerably earlier. Its residents had built a genuine community, not without conflict, not without the ordinary difficulties of people living in close proximity across many generations, but with a coherence and continuity that the wasteland's surface communities would have recognized as something worth preserving. They had no idea that their vault had been designed to kill them. The scientist whose conscience had disabled the pathogen dispersal system before, the vault sealed had not left a record of what they had done in any location accessible to the vault's residents. The modification was invisible in the facility's operational records, disguised within the maintenance documentation that had accumulated across 2 centuries to the point where any specific entry from the sealing period required deliberate archival research to locate. The residents of Vault 81 knew their facility had an unusual medical research history. They did not know that the history they were aware of was the surface of something that had been prevented from running its intended course by a single person's decision. The sole survivor who arrived at Vault 81 from the ruins of a nearby neighborhood found a community that was functional, cautious about outsiders, in the way that functional communities in the wasteland had learned to be, and entirely unaware of the specific nature of what it owed to someone whose name appeared in no memorial and whose choice appeared in no record, that the current residents could access. The debt existed. It was simply owed to a person who had made the choice and then disappeared into the same catastrophe that had ended everything else from that period, leaving no way for the obligation to be acknowledged. That one refusal had produced 2 centuries of ordinary life in a sealed facility. The arithmetic was not subtle. The pod in Sector C of Vault 111 failed its seal integrity check on the morning of November 9th, 2287. The automated diagnostic system that identified the failure had been running the same checks on the same schedule for 210 years, flagging failures as they occurred and logging them in the maintenance archive that had been accumulating since the day the vault sealed. Most of the failures it had logged across those 2 centuries had not been repaired. The maintenance systems were automated, but their capacity to address structural pod failures was limited, and the resource constraints of a sealed facility running without external supply had progressively narrowed what the automated systems could accomplish. The sole survivor who emerged from the one pod that had maintained integrity across the full span did not emerge into the facility they remembered entering. The staff who had guided them into their pod were gone. Most of the other residents, whose pods they could see through the frost-covered glass, had not survived the system failures of the intervening decades. The vault that had been designed to study temporal displacement had produced its experimental subject through a combination of designed isolation and accidental attrition, not the controlled emergence the protocol had specified, but an outcome that served the experiment's core variable in a more extreme form than the designers had anticipated. The Commonwealth that waited beyond the vault entrance was not a slightly changed version of the world the sole survivor had known in 2077. It was a different world that had been built by different people from the ruins of the one that had existed before. The Institute operated beneath it with the sealed certainty of an organization that had never needed to account for itself. The Brotherhood had arrived from the capital wasteland with the conviction of a force that believed its mission justified its methods. The railroad moved through it in hiding, pursuing a specific moral position about synthetic people that the surface world's other factions found variously sympathetic or threatening. The Minutemen existed as the remnant of something that had once been more and was attempting, without sufficient resources, to become that again. The sole survivor moved through all of it, carrying a perspective that none of the other participants shared, the direct experience of the world that had produced every institution currently operating in the Commonwealth, combined with the specific loss of everyone and everything the world had contained for them personally. The cryogenic experiment had produced its data point. The data point was a person with a dead spouse, a stolen child, and 2 centuries of history to catch up on before any of the immediate questions could be addressed. The Brotherhood of Steel had not been founded as a reaction to Vault-Tec specifically. Its origins in the immediate post-war chaos of 2077. The soldiers and scientists who separated from the collapsing military structure under the leadership of Roger Maxson, establishing themselves at Lost Hills in California, with the specific mission of preserving advanced technology from the destruction and misuse that had characterized the pre-war period, were responses to a broader failure than any single institution represented. Maxson and the people around him had witnessed, directly and personally, what happened when the organizations controlling powerful technology operated without accountability. The West-Tec facility at Mariposa had been under their supervision. They had seen what the FEV research produced when the institutional distance between the scientists and the consequences of their work was absolute. The doctrine they built from that experience, the conviction that advanced technology required controlled custodianship, that its acquisition and preservation were obligations that justified significant cost, that its distribution to populations not equipped to use it responsibly created dangers that outweighed the benefits, was a direct response to the pre-war institutional logic that had produced the Vault program and everything adjacent to it. The Brotherhood was not Vault-Tec's opposite in any simple sense. It shared certain structural features: the sealed hierarchy, the separation from ordinary surface society, the conviction that its mission justified methods that the people affected by those methods had not consented to. But its founding impulse was the recognition that unaccountable institutional power was dangerous, and its purpose was to place that power under the specific accountability structure it had developed, rather than to eliminate accountability entirely. Whether that distinction made the Brotherhood a meaningful improvement on the institutions it had formed in opposition to was quite to learn that the Brotherhood's history across the following 2 centuries answered in ways that complicated any simple positive assessment. The organization had fractures, internal conflicts, doctrinal disputes that sometimes produced outcomes indistinguishable from the institutional rigidity it had been founded to resist. It expanded and contracted and lost chapters and founded new ones and arrived In the 23rd century, as a presence in multiple regions of the wasteland, with different characters in each location, and a shared name that covered a range of actual practices. What it consistently represented across those variations and across that span of time was the attempt, imperfect, contested, never fully resolved, to hold advanced technological power to some standard of accountability. The attempt existed because the pre-war world had demonstrated what happened in its absence. Every vault door standing open or sealed across the wasteland was evidence of what that demonstration had cost. The Brotherhood had looked at that evidence and decided it required a response. The specific response it had chosen was debatable. The decision to respond was not. A Mr. Handy unit in the residential wing of a vault outside Wheeling had been polishing the same corridor floor for 63 years without interruption. The residents of that facility had been gone for decades. The circumstances of their departure recorded in logs that the unit's programming did not include the capacity to read or process. Its operational directive was maintenance. The corridor required maintenance. The unit performed maintenance. The logic was complete and self-contained, and entirely indifferent to the absence of anyone to benefit from the clean floor it produced each morning, with the same cheerful efficiency it had applied on every previous morning since the vault sealed. Across the wasteland, in facilities whose populations had dispersed or died or emerged into the surface, decades or generations earlier, Vault-Tec's automated infrastructure continued its assigned functions, with the patient persistence of systems that had been built to run without human direction and had simply never received the instruction to stop. Emergency broadcast signals repeated on radio frequencies across the AM band. Pre-war voices recorded in studios that no longer existed, inviting listeners to report to vault locations for admission processing. The voices were warm and professional. The vault locations they described had been tombs for a century in some cases. The broadcasts did not distinguish between these facts. They had not been programmed to. In the regional offices that Vault-Tec had operated across the country, the buildings that had housed the representatives and the application processors, and the administrative staff who had kept the lottery machinery running. Terminals still displayed quarterly projections for fiscal periods that the calendar had long since passed. The projections were detailed and precise, formatted with the professional thoroughness of documents produced by people who expected them to be reviewed. Nobody reviewed them. The terminals generated them on schedule because the schedule had been set and the schedule ran. In some offices, the projections had been accumulating in the system's memory for long enough that the storage architecture was approaching its limits, a technical condition that the automated diagnostic systems flagged in maintenance reports that were also generated on schedule, and also reviewed by nobody. The company that had built all of this had ceased to exist as a functioning organization on the afternoon of October 23rd, 2077. Its physical infrastructure had not received the notification. The vault doors that stood open or sealed across the continent had accumulated meanings that their engineers had not designed them to carry. The gear symbol, that distinctive circular logo, the interlocking teeth that had been chosen for structural rather than aesthetic reasons, the design that had appeared on every piece of Vault-Tec promotional material for 40 years, had become something different in the 2 centuries, since the company that created it had stopped operating. Different communities read it differently, in the way that symbols acquire meaning from the experiences of the people encountering them, rather than from the intentions of the people who created them. To scavengers working the ruins of the Mid-Atlantic region, a gear symbol on a sealed door meant resources, food stores, medical supplies, pre-war technology in varying states of functionality, the specific category of valuable that required considerable risk to access, but rewarded that risk more reliably than most alternatives. To settlers in the Southwest, the same symbol on an open door meant shelter. The pre-built infrastructure of vault residential sections, providing a foundation for communities that would have taken generations to construct from surface materials. To the raider groups that had established themselves in certain empty facilities, the symbol meant territory, the defensibility of an underground position, with limited entry points and extensive internal space, that the original designers had inadvertently made ideal for exactly this purpose. Vault 22's lower levels had become a source of botanical material for agricultural researchers working in the Nevada region. The plant hybrid ecosystems that the spore experiment had produced, horrifying in their original context, had stabilized across generations into something that could be carefully harvested for specimens useful in soil remediation work. The irony of the experiment's most catastrophic outcome, providing material for the reconstruction of the surface environments it had never been intended to affect, was not lost on the researchers who made the connection. It was simply the kind of irony that the wasteland produced with regularity. The gap between intended and actual outcomes, measured in generations, and expressed in forms that the original designers would not have recognized. Vault 34's flooded chambers, irradiated to levels that required protection to navigate, yielded weapons caches to those with the preparation and the patience to reach them. The armory that had been stocked before the vault sealed remained partially intact beneath the water, accessible to salvagers who understood what they were looking for and were willing to accept the exposure costs of finding it. The vault had failed as a shelter. It had succeeded, inadvertently, as a long-term storage facility for equipment that the wasteland found useful. The terminals that still functioned in abandoned Vault-Tec facilities held two categories of information, and the difference between them was the difference between what the company had been willing to say publicly and what it had recorded for internal purposes. The first category, technical manuals, maintenance schedules, operational procedures, inventory records, was accessible to anyone with basic terminal literacy and contained information of genuine practical value. Mechanics who could read the water recycling documentation could maintain systems that communities depended on. Engineers who understood the power generation schematics could keep geothermal systems running that would otherwise have failed from accumulated neglect. The preserved technical knowledge in these records had a direct relationship to survival in settlements, fortunate enough to have functioning vault infrastructure nearby. The second category required clearance codes that most people did not have, or the technical skill to bypass authentication systems that had been designed to be difficult to circumvent. What those files contained, the experimental logs, the classified design specifications, the internal communications of people who had understood what the Vault program was and had written about it, without the careful framing of the public-facing documents, was a different kind of valuable. Valuable not for what it enabled, but for what it explained. A historian working in the NCR had spent 3 years accessing and transcribing the contents of a Vault-Tec regional office terminal that had been recovered from a collapsed building in Northern California. Her published account of what those files contained, the experiment categories, the selection criteria, the specific parameters of individual facilities, had circulated through academic and political communities in ways that complicated several established narratives about Vault emergence histories. Communities that had understood their own origins in terms that credited Vault-Tec with genuine preservation intent had been given. Through her work, a more complete version of the situation. Some of them had found that version difficult to incorporate into the self-understanding they had built over generations. Others had found it clarifying. The truth that Vault-Tec had buried in encrypted files had a tendency to surface eventually. The company had not designed its record-keeping systems with the expectation that its classified files would be accessed by the descendants of the people those files described. It had designed them to be secure against contemporary access, which they were. 2 centuries of accumulated technical knowledge and the specific motivation of communities trying to understand their own histories had proven to be a combination that the original security architecture had not been built to resist indefinitely. Norm MacLean had been inside Vault 31 for 20 minutes before he understood that the people in the cryogenic pods were not Vault residents. The facility connected to his home vault through a corridor that the overseer's access protocols had never listed as restricted. An oversight, or something that looked like one, in the administrative structure of a system that Norm had been examining with increasing attention for weeks. The pods in Vault 31 were occupied. The biometric indicators on the pod's external displays showed stable life signs, the slow rhythms of cryogenic suspension running normally across the full row of units. The faces visible through the frost-covered glass were the faces of adults in late middle age, dressed not in the standard Vault suit that every resident of Vaults 32 and 33 wore, but in a style of clothing that Norm recognized from the pre-war photographs in the Vault's educational materials. These people had not entered the Vault on October 23rd, 2077, as residents seeking shelter. They had entered it as its architects, and they had been here since before Norm's grandparents were born. The Buds program, the leadership training curriculum that had been producing Vault 33's overseers for as long as the Vault's institutional memory extended, had not been designed by pre-war planners and then left to run automatically in their absence. It had been designed by pre-war planners who had arranged to remain present for its execution. The executives preserved in Vault 31's cryogenic chambers had been waking at intervals across 2 centuries, reviewing the connected community's development, making adjustments to the succession planning and the educational framework, and the interbreeding protocols, and returning to suspension. The program had never been autonomous. It had been supervised. The plan that Norm had grown up inside, the community that had formed him, the values that he had understood as his own, all of it had been under continuous management by people who had been old before his family line began, who had made decisions about what kind of people the Vault would produce, and then preserved themselves long enough to verify that the decisions were being implemented correctly. He stood in the corridor outside the pod room and processed this for a long time. The hum of the cryogenic systems was the only sound. It was a specific kind of hum, steady, patient, the sound of machinery that had been performing the same function for so long that the function had become indistinguishable from the machinery itself. Hank MacLean had been carrying the pre-war world inside him for 2 centuries. His emergence from Vault 33 into the California wasteland, first as an overseer managing his community's external relations, then as a figure in the larger drama that his daughter Lucy's departure had set in motion, placed a pre-war Vault-Tec executive directly into contact with the consequences of decisions he had participated in making. The wasteland he moved through was not an abstraction. It was the physical result of choices that had been made in rooms he had been in, by people he had known, including himself. His Season 2 journey into New Vegas brought him into a region where the pre-war world's traces were more visible than almost anywhere else in the wasteland, preserved in the neon and the casino infrastructure that House had maintained, present in the Vault network whose legacy had shaped the Mojave's post-war development, present in Cooper Howard's transformed existence as the Ghoul, the pre-war actor who had been part of the promotional apparatus that Vault-Tec had used to sell its program to a frightened population, and who had survived to witness what that program had produced. These were people who had been adults in the world that built the vaults. The wasteland contained very few of them. Their presence in the same region, in 2296, was the presence of the pre-war world itself, moving through its own consequences, carrying the knowledge of what had been intended and encountering, at every turn, the reality of what had actually happened instead. Cooper Howard's specific understanding of that gap, developed across 2 centuries, of surviving in a form that Vault-Tec's promotional work had never depicted, was different in character from Hank's. Hank carried the pre-war world as a project still in progress. Cooper carried it as evidence. The distinction between those 2 positions was the distance between someone who still believed the plan was worth completing and someone who had lived long enough to see what the plan had cost. New Vegas existed in the space between them, a city built on pre-war infrastructure by a pre-war survivor pursuing pre-war ambitions in a world that had moved 2 centuries past the context those ambitions had been formed in. The Lucky 38 tower rising above the strip was the most visible artifact of what it looked like when someone from the old world refused to stop. Whether refusal of that kind represented continuity or obstruction was a question the Mojave was still working out.